Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honour to present my fifth report to you as the independent expert on the human rights situation in Mali. I would like to express how satisfied I am with the high-quality cooperation which I've had from the Malian government. I'd also like to take this opportunity to extend my most respectful greetings to the two Malian ministers who are joining us here this morning in the Council. This also reflects Mali's interest in promoting and protecting human rights. I would also like to thank all the stakeholders who have provided me with information which has been a useful contribution to my report. My presentation will focus on the following two issues: the security crisis and its impact on the lives of civilians, and secondly, the shrinking of civil space or space for civil society and the respect for the rule of law, which is what the Human Rights Council insisted on during its interactive dialogue this year. I will also finish off with the most urgent recommendations to implement, and these are outlined in greater detail in the end of mission reports on my visits in August 2022 and February 2023. With regards to the security situation, despite considerable efforts made by the Malian authorities, the situation is still very worrying because of attacks against civilians. MINUSMA and the Malian Defence and Security Forces. These have been carried out by violent extremist groups such as the Support Group for Islam and Muslims and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, as well as other similar groups, as well as unidentified armed individuals who act like the violent extremist groups. In fact, Mali faces serious challenges. The most obvious reflections of this are the continuing rise in the number of internally displaced people, as well as the worrying deterioration in education in Mali with the closure of schools because of insecurity. So, from April last year up until now, there's been a 13% increase in the number of internally displaced persons, rising from nearly 363,000 in April last year up to over 412,000 by the end of last year. The number of schools closed because of a lack of security has increased by around 20%, from 1,632 schools in March last year to 1,958 by the end of last year. With regard to the human rights situation, there's been considerable progress, notably on the 23rd of November 2022, implementing regulations for the law setting the general rules for reparations for serious human rights violations was adopted, and also on the 1st of February 2023, a draft text to create a national human rights directorate was adopted. I would call upon Mali's partners in the international community to support Mali in implementing these initiatives. When it comes to fighting impunity, a number of convictions have been handed down to people for crimes linked to enslavement by descent during a special court session which was held in Kaye between the 27th of February and the 17th of March this year. This is the first time this has happened in Mali, so I'd like to encourage the Malian authorities to speed up their efforts so that they can try the suspects of serious human rights violations mentioned in my previous reports as quickly as possible. With this in mind, I would like to recall that exactly 1 year since an indeterminate number of civilians were killed during an operation conducted by Malian forces who were accompanied by Russian military personnel in the village of Mora in Mopti region. That was between the 27th and 31st of March last year. So far, the authorities haven't followed up on their announcement that an investigation would be conducted. Whilst I hail the progress that I've mentioned, I'm still worried by the devastating impact that the crisis and the conflict has had on civilians during the period under review in my report. According to recently published information by MINUSMA, the number of civilians killed in 2021 was 584, and that's rose to 1,277 last year. That's of serious concern. It's a 118% rise. Recurring cases of gender-based violence is also very disturbing. According to the reports of the Gender-Based Violence Information Management System, in 2021, there were 9,540 cases of gender-based violence, and that rose last year to 14,264 cases last year. That's a 49% increase. I encourage the Malian authorities to put in place measures to prevent attacks against civilians and to strengthen their protection. I'd also like to say that I am deeply disturbed by the shrinking of space for civil society. It's almost disappeared, as well as for freedom of expression, press, association, and there is growing self-censorship. I'm also very worried about attacks and media lynching against human rights defenders. I was attacked on social media when I arrived in Mali in 2023. The arrival actually coincided with Malian authorities' decision to declare the Human Rights Division Director of MINUSMA persona non grata. I regret that decision, and for the first time, when I arrived in Bamako, my assistant and I were held and questioned by police officers. We protested to the Malian authorities and they have apologised. We accept that apology, of course, but a number of human rights defenders, journalists and other media professionals that I met during my 2 visits have referred to taboo subjects which they do not dare address because they fear reprisals from Malian authorities or their supporters. The taboo subjects include allegations of human rights violations attributed to the Malian Defence and Security Forces and the Russian security and military personnel, which a number of people that I met in Mali call Wagner. A number of human rights defenders have declared that they've been victims of hostility by certain state authorities and that the Malian state is trying to asphyxiate or sabotage the work of human rights defenders, that they continue to be stateless persons or enemies of the nation. And they are allies of major foreign powers which are hostile to the Malian authorities. This stigmatization by state representatives has been backed up by a certain opinion, and these are new threats to the safety of human rights defenders. This shrinking of civil space is particularly worrying because the country is now engaged in an electoral process. There must be wide-ranging debate on political programs and thought. So I would encourage Malian authorities to ensure that human rights and freedom of opinion, expression, press, peaceful assembly and association are guaranteed for all stakeholders, including, in particular, civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, as well as political parties and movements, including those from the opposition. The elections should be the moment in which all freedoms blossom. Now, in view of the concerns I've raised in my report, I would like to make 3 specific recommendations on cooperation on human rights suspicions. When it comes to the responses to the multidimensional crisis, I encourage the Malian authorities and international authorities to rethink their strategies by focusing more on integrated strategies to ensure citizens' safety, development, as well as the respect, protection, implementation of human rights. We must ensure that the geopolitical turmoil at the moment does not adversely affect cooperation between Mali and the international community. So I recommend that Mali maintain and strengthen these links. It seems as though security in Mali is the way of guaranteeing regional security because Mali is the epicenter of the terrorist threat. I would also like to warn Mali and the international community against using human rights as a political tool because that makes the work of civil society, human rights defenders and international organizations as well as my own more and more difficult. I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Now, according to our usual practice, I'm going to invite the delegation of country concerned, His Excellency Mamadou Kassagoue, Minister of Justice and Human Rights of Mali. You have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, my delegation has taken careful note of the independent experts' report on the human rights situation in Mali, and I would like to make a few comments now. Generally speaking, I deplore the overall approach in the report, which is a writ of prosecution. It hasn't taken stock of the many efforts made and the considerable progress made in security as well as promoting and protecting human rights. The independent expert, though, has noted that there's been a reduction in number of human rights violations, which reflects the improving security situation. In addition, we regret the fact that facts transmitted by the government have not been taken into consideration. The independent expert mentions the constant challenge of impunity, but I'd like to here recall some of the measures that the Malian authorities have taken to fight impunity. We deeply regret that the report insinuates there's a lack of political will or incapacity of the state to bring prosecutions. In these lines, the transitional authorities are steadfastly committed to fighting impunity. This is reflected by the fact that a number of special court sessions to judge human rights violations have been held over the past 3 years. We are determined to fight against enslavement by descent. A number of robust measures have been taken, including a draft bill to punish enslavement and a special court session in Kayes in March this year, in which over 100 people were tried. The government is unremitting when it comes to prosecuting and punishing the perpetrators of serious human rights violations, and we are only held up by objective constraints in our efforts. Nevertheless, we are constantly bringing credible allegations of serious human rights violations to the competent courts authorities' notice. I also refute the accusation that the Malian army's military operations stigmatise certain communities. I would like to recall that the Malian army is Republican, professional, multi-ethnic and aware of its primary responsibility to protect all civilians. When it comes to the shrinking of space for civil society, I would like to underscore that there are no restrictions in Mali on democratic freedoms, and that freedom of expression or opinion are guaranteed in the constitution. Like other countries, civil freedoms are regulated by a law which seeks to protect the rights of citizens and to preserve public order. As you know, respect for Malian citizens' rights is closely monitored by the National Human Rights Commission. It's independent and has an A rating, which reflects its professionalism. When it comes to political institutional reforms, I'd like to recall that at the behest of Colonel Assimi Goïta, who's the president of the transition, we have created a timetable for political and electoral reform. This has been adopted in an inclusive, transparent manner involving all the nation stakeholders as well as our partners in ECOWAS, the African Union and the UN. We had all the political parties and civil society organisations take part in debating the electoral law and its enactment, and as well as the drafting of a new constitution, follow the same pattern. When it comes to peace and reconciliation and the Algiers agreement, the government is diligently going about its implementation despite current difficulties. When it comes to the security situation in the centre, it's gradually improving, and we see that administration and basic social services are being restored through a number of projects and programmes. When it comes to transitional justice, we've adopted a national reparations policy and action plan for the period 2021-2025, setting out the general rules for repairing damages caused by serious human rights violations. We've created a specific agency for these reparations. When it comes to fighting gender-based violence, it's another government priority, which is part of the reforms of the justice sector. We have also created the National Human Rights Directorate, a National Economic and Financial Hub, and an agency for recovering and managing seized or confiscated assets, as well as a judicial hub which is specialised in fighting cybercrime. President, ladies and gentlemen, to round off, the Malian government reaffirms its steadfast commitment to pursue cooperation with all human rights mechanisms, and we're opposed to using human rights as a political tool.
Now indicate that the list of speakers is closed now, and I invite the interested delegations to ask questions and make comments to the independent experts. And let me remind you also that the speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds. The first delegation on my list is Belgium, speaking on behalf of a group of countries. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
President, this statement is made on behalf of the Benelux countries, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and my own country, Belgium. Mr. Independent Expert, once again, we see a worsening of the security situation in Mali, and now that's the case throughout the country, and we see the consequences of that on the enjoyment of human rights by people in the country. Although we commend the Mali authorities' commitments to cooperate with your mandate, they do not seem to recognize nor understand the gravity of the situation. Benelux countries call upon Mali authorities to cooperate with the various UN mechanisms that exist relating to human rights in Mali. Obstacles in implementing the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement in Mali are a cause of great concern in a situation that's already very fragile. The abuses of Wagner mercenaries are another cause for concern. Most human rights abuses are committed by armed groups and organizations or by extremist terrorist groupings. The total lack of implementation of the recommendations from the International Commission of Inquiry for Mali is also a concern that our three Benelux countries share. We are concerned about the shrinking of civic space. Violations against children within the context of armed conflict are another cause of serious concern. 2022 was probably the deadliest year for children in the Central Sahel since the beginning of this crisis. We call upon Mali to organize in a sustainable way reintegration and rehabilitation programs and to complete revision of legislation on the protection of children in order to put an end to these practices.
The delegation of the European Union, you have the floor.
Monsieur l'expert.
Independent Expert, the European Union thanks you for your report, and we commend the clear commitment that exists to renew your mandate, a commitment that has been shown by the Mali authorities, who have indicated that since the beginning of this session. The situation in Mali remains a cause of concern for us. We support the recommendations in your report. We need to focus on human rights and also development for people in Mali, and that has to be our top priority. We continue to deplore Mali's decision to withdraw from Sahel G5. Integration and cooperation at regional level are vital if the country is to be able to overcome the many challenges that exist for it and within the region. We know that people living in Mali are suffering the consequences of decisions taken. Serious abuses are also being committed by Wagner mercenaries, and we share your view that we do need to investigate this situation, and the fact there is no systematic effort to do so casts doubts over the commitment of the Mali authorities to fight impunity. We also regret the fact that the director of MINUSMA's Human Rights Division has been expelled. We therefore believe that a lot needs to be done. However, when it comes to gender-based violence, here we would ask you, what do you think can be done apart from legislation being adopted to counter this scourge? Thank you.
And now Iceland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We thank the independent expert for the report. We are alarmed by the deteriorating human rights situation accompanying Mali's worsening security crisis, including the systematic targeting of civilians by extremist armed groups. We are deeply concerned by continued reports of violations committed by national forces and the Wagner Group, including of conflict-related gender-based violence. It should be recalled that the Malian authorities also carry the responsibility for violations committed by foreign military companies on their behalf. Strengthening access to justice, fighting impunity and increasing accountability is crucial. The report clearly illustrates that much remains to be done. We note with deep concern the shrinking civic space and growing pressure on freedom of expression, including attacks on human rights defenders. The decision by Malian authorities to declare the Director of Human Rights Division of the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Mali persona non grata and the difficulties which the independent expert faced during his visit are worrying developments. In closing, how can the Malian authorities improve freedom of speech and association, and how can the international community most effectively address the shrinking civic space in Mali? I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Côte d'Ivoire, you have the floor.
President, the African Group wishes to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Mali, headed by the Minister, His Excellency Mr. Kassougui. We also thank the independent expert for his report on the situation of human rights in Mali. We note the complexity of the situation there. There are many challenges: terrorism, international organized crime, climate change. All of these things create conditions that are favorable to human rights violations and to a worsening humanitarian situation. We commend progress made in the framework of protecting civilians and enhancing security in the country, and we encourage the authorities to do more in that direction. We also commend progress made as part of the transition progress, in particular the fact that a consensus-based timeline for a return to constitutional order has been adopted in cooperation with ECOWAS, the African Union and the UN. We would urge Mali's partners to support Mali in order to organise the forthcoming elections that we hope will be free, fair, transparent, inclusive and credible. And we hope they will be conducted in conditions of security, guaranteeing the participation of the greatest possible number of people. We believe that the government of Mali needs to continue to work to promote, protect and ensure respect for human rights, and needs to keep an appropriate level of cooperation with the Council and its various mechanisms.
Sierra Leone, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone aligns itself with the statements of the African Group and thanks the independent experts for his report. We support the Transition Charter and welcome the peace agreement on political transition in Mali. As a member state of ECOWAS, Sierra Leone is prepared to support the people of Mali to secure peace, stability and prosperity. My delegation is pleased that the independent expert was able to travel to Mali and commend the government of Mali for cooperating with the independent expert. We acknowledge and welcome the continued engagement of the heads of state of ECOWAS with the military in resolving the political and economic situation in Mali. We express deep concern about reports of continued attacks on extremist groups. These violent extremist groups pose a dangerous threat to civilians, humanitarian workers, for the stability and security of the state of Mali. While we welcome the commitment made by the Malian transitional authorities to increase the number of women participating in the work of the Agreement Monitoring Committee, we note with concern the independent experts' call to end impunity. As a post-conflict country, Sierra Leone stands ready to share its experiences with its sister, the Republic of Mali. We call for provisional and technical assistance for Mali in the field of human rights and echo the independent expert recommendation for the restoration of peace and the authority of the state of Mali throughout its territory. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso wishes to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Mali, headed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Justice. We thank the independent expert for the submission of his report on the human rights situation in Mali, and we note the conclusions and recommendations. Burkina Faso commends the renewed commitment of the authorities in Mali to ensure respect for, protection of, achievement of and promotion of human rights for all people there. We also note their constructive commitment to work with the independent expert in order to find lasting solutions to human rights issues in Mali. We condemn all forms of violations of human rights and all attacks on such rights in Mali, in particular terrorist attacks on civilians, representatives of local, regional and central institutions, as well as attacks on the Mali security forces and MINUSMA. That being so, we commend the efforts deployed by the government of Mali to bring to justice those who perpetrate, order, or organize such acts and those who fund them. In conclusion, Burkina Faso calls upon the international community to continue to give Mali, in accordance with its requirements, the assistance that is required to ensure stability in order to promote respect for all human rights and to fight effectively against impunity. Thank you.
Merci à vous, monsieur. Now let me invite the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Independent Expert, the United States welcomes your briefing and shares your concern about stability and security in Mali. First and foremost, we call on the Malian transition government to protect all human rights defenders in Mali without exception. We urge the transition government to cooperate with all MINUSMA human rights activities, specifically with requests for access to sites of alleged human rights violations and abuses. We remain gravely concerned about the alleged involvement of the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group in human rights abuses. It is critical that the independent expert, OHCHR, and MINUSMA be able to provide an honest and transparent accounting of Wagner's destabilizing role in Mali. Finally, we continue to offer our full support and encouragement to those within Mali's transition government who endeavor to restore democracy, civilian rule, and constitutional order. We will join the international community in closely following the constitutional referendum and continued preparation for local, legislative, and presidential elections. Our question is, what are the next steps for the proposed independent investigation into possible atrocities in Mali linked to the Wagner Group? I thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting the delegation of China.
Mr. President, China is highly concerned at the development of the situation in Mali. Its security and stability affect not only itself, but also greatly the Sahel and the wider region. China always supports Africans in solving African problems in African ways. We support Mali in strengthening communication and coordination with regional organizations to seek solutions conducive to the stability and development of Mali and the region. China supports the government's efforts to promote and protect human rights. We hope that the international community will fully respect Mali's sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and based on the needs of the government and the people, provide them with technical assistance on human rights and help the government to build capacity to better promote and protect human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela via Zoom.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. We've taken note of the independent expert's report on the human rights situation in Mali. He recently visited the country in February. Item 10 of the Council's agenda was designed to address technical assistance and capacity building with the support of the country concerned, and to improve the human rights situation in the field through genuine dialogue and cooperation. We appreciate Mali's cooperation with the Council and its mechanisms and the country's readiness to act to improve the human rights situation. Mali's government has spared no effort in investigating human rights violations and has established the National Human Rights Directorate, which is an important step to strengthen institutions in this area. We also highlight Mali's commitment to enforcing the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, its cooperation with regional and sub-regional mechanisms which support the country in achieving its aims. The Council, multilateral organisations and international agencies must provide cooperation and technical assistance that Mali seeks in the area of human rights and must adhere to the universal principles of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states enshrined in the UN Charter. Thank you very much.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. We highly value the positive efforts deployed by the independent experts on human rights in Mali. We equally applaud the efforts deployed by the government of Mali in order to improve the human rights situation and its positive engagement with the local, regional, and international mechanisms. We express our concerns with regards to the spread of terrorist groups in the country and its violation of human rights, as well as violations targeting civilians and infrastructure. We encourage the government to continue its efforts to live up to the security-related challenges in order to improve human rights situation in general and reinforce legislations to hold the perpetrators accountable for human violations. We stress the provision of technical support to Mali in order for it to achieve stability, reinforce human rights in line with its needs and priorities, and in a way that allows it to meet the challenges that are still facing it, and for it to be able to restore security and stability in Mali and in the Sahel region. And thank you very much, Mr. President.
United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned by the deteriorating situation in Mali. The Malian authorities' obstruction of MINUSMA's Human Rights Division, including expelling its director, undermines the UN's critical efforts to monitor, report on, and investigate allegations of human rights violations and abuses. We urge the authorities to facilitate the UN's work as mandated by this Council and the UN Security Council by allowing unrestricted access for investigations to take place. A year on from the horrific massacre in Maura, we hope the UN will issue its report and shed light on what happened. Long-term stability requires accountability and justice. Mr. President, we welcome the report of the independent expert. His statistics on sexual and gender-based violence are shocking and must be addressed without delay. We urge the Malian authorities to quickly adopt new legislation on this issue. We also note the expert's reference to credible reports of Russian military and security personnel, namely Wagner Group, committing human rights abuses in Mali. There must be accountability. Mr. Tyne, we note the press statement issued by UN experts in January of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by government forces and Wagner Group. What is your assessment? I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Spain thanks the independent expert for his report. We're deeply concerned at the serious downturn in the country and the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. These have been committed by terrorist groups, the Malian Defence and Security Forces and the Wagner Group against civilians. We believe that fighting impunity and accountability for these violations, as well as implementing the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, are imperative for working towards lasting national reconciliation. The postponement of the constitutional referendum is an obstacle to achieving the timeframe agreed between Mali and ECOWAS for returning to a civilian regime. There must be transparent, inclusive and credible elections which allow a return to constitutional law. We do hope that the new NGO regulation won't hamper these organisations' activities. It's vital that technical assistance and cooperation to the Malian transitional authorities to establish robust human rights protection and promotion mechanisms be delivered. In your opinion, how can the international community help create the climate for credible and transparent presidential elections? Thank you.
Thank you, President. Thank you, President. We align ourselves with a statement by the African Group on this item. We took note of the recommendations by the independent expert on the human rights situation in Mali, and we welcome the efforts deployed by Mali in order to restore peace, reinforce stability, and ensure the safety of civilians and ensure a peaceful transition in spite of staggering challenges facing the country, which are of a humanitarian, environmental, and security-related nature. In the same vein, we welcome welcome the regional and international support of national efforts to ensure that Mali conduct the current transition period smoothly and peacefully, leading to a sustainable and stable democracy. We call upon the UNHRC to provide technical support to Mali in line of its national priorities and needs and with respect of its sovereignty, particularly its efforts which aim to improve human rights and achieve stability, reinforce democracy and the rule of law in line with African-led solutions of African problems. We call upon the international community to provide other types of support of Mali to live up to the challenges facing it. And thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. South Sudan is the next.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Sudan aligns itself with the statement of the African Group and welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Mali headed by His Excellency Mahamadou Kassogoua, Minister of Justice and Human Rights, and we kindly listen to the report of the independent expert on Mali. We commend Malian's government for the process made so far in the establishment of a consensual timetable for a return to constitution's order. Despite challenges related to terrorism and efforts of the climate change in Mali, the government's willingness to introduce laws and measures that create a conducive ground for the legal frameworks, the protecting of the civilian population, and securing the territory, which aimed in advance the human rights, is indicated the commitment of the government to fulfill its obligation in promoting the human rights in the ground. In the country, we call on the international community to support efforts being taken by the government of Mali to restore peace by providing technical assistance to this country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now we will see a video statement by Libya.
السيد الرئيس، تعرف بلادي عن شكرها وتقديرها للخبير المستقل المعني بحالة حقوق الإنسان في مالي.
Thank you. My delegation wishes to thank the independent expert for his report. He has highlighted progress made by Mali in human rights areas. We commend the efforts being undertaken by the government, and we applaud cooperation with regional and international mechanisms. In that context, Libya wishes to underscore the importance of providing Mali with technical assistance and also allowing it to consolidate its capacities to improve the human rights situation in the country. Assistance must be tailored to meet the needs and the priorities of Mali. That is important in order to allow Mali to overcome the challenges it is facing on many fronts. It's also important to bring security and stability back to Mali and to the Sahel region.
The list is Senegal.
Thank you, President. The delegation of Senegal associates itself with the statement made by Côte d'Ivoire, speaking on behalf of the African Group. We thank the independent expert for his report. Senegal commends the ongoing commitment of the authorities in Mali in seeking to improve the human rights situation in their country. My delegation welcomes in particular the adoption by the government of Mali of a national strategy to stabilize the central region of the country. This is accompanied by an action plan 2022-2024. It should make it possible to fight more effectively against intercommunal violence, which is continuing to bring so much grief to that part of the country. My country encourages Mali to continue to work to restore the authority of the state throughout the country. Lastly, and looking towards a time of emerging from this crisis, we wish to endorse recommendations made by the independent expert to the effect that we need to continue to support locally based initiatives for peace, prevention of conflict, mediation and conflict resolution, also for dialogue and reconciliation. This involves using traditional mechanisms for peace building or peace consolidation, and this should allow Mali to achieve lasting and fair peace throughout the country. Thank you.
Monsieur, Algeria is the next. Not in the room, so let me invite Mauritania via video.
Thank you, President. My delegation wishes to thank the independent expert for his presentation. Mauritania commends the constructive commitment of Mali and its good cooperation with international mechanisms on human rights, in particular, its cooperation with the independent expert. We welcome the adoption by the transition authorities of a consensus-based timeline to ensure a return to constitutional order in the country. This has been done in cooperation with ECOWAS, the African Union and the UN. And it will involve the organisation of free, fair and transparent elections. We welcome the national strategy for stabilising the central part of the country and its accompanying action plan 2022-24 that was launched in Mopti on the 21st of March. And this involves the rolling out of security development and governance hubs. In conclusion, we urge the international community to continue to give Mali the assistance it needs to ensure stability, national reconciliation and peace in that country. Thank you.
Now, my understanding is that Mr. Tine would like to take the floor, so I'm passing the floor to him. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. I would like to commend in particular the statement made by His Excellency Minister Khashoggi. In my way of working, I certainly never try to accuse anybody. I try to work with people. And in my report, I have indeed emphasized progress. Authorities in Mali have adopted a timeline for transition. I think all countries that have had a coup d'etat in West Africa have encountered the same problems. But Mali's the only one that's really made progress, that said, look, we're going to have elections. They've done that. They've put in place the mechanisms to allow them to do that. They have worked on drafting a constitution, and they're also fighting against impunity. And it was really a first. What you did on enslavement, for instance, in trying to ensure that all crimes relating to enslavement by descent will be punished. And that's very positive. I want to be very clear about that. It's obvious that you're deeply interested in human rights, that you want to make progress in that area. Now, a question was asked about gender-based violence. Now, Mali's a big country. There's a lot of insecurity in the country. Clearly, we need to intervene, to look at the situation there and try to improve the security situation overall, ensuring that we can strengthen the authority of the state, strengthen security throughout the country, and punish all of those who commit gender-based violence. And the more you do on creating the security framework, the easier it will be to do that. And I think having a really strong security framework is the key. Now, on another issue, questions have been asked about Wagner. Wagner's certainly been mentioned, and there has been mention made also of Russian security personnel. Now, when we last spoke with the government of Mali, we discussed a number of things with them, and we had some very specific testimony on this issue. Beside Mopti Airport, for instance, we had this discussion, and the government told us, we've noted what has been said, and we're going to open an inquiry, an investigation into these alleged crimes. That, again, is something that we very much appreciated. Now, most of what has been said makes a contribution to the ongoing dialogue and commends the work that has been done. And there's also been a lot of praise for the commitment of the Mali authorities. There will be elections shortly in Mali, and that might ring a few warning bells. After all, elections are things where it's very important that people can move around, that they can express their views freely, that they can get together. We need to ensure freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. These things are very important, especially in the run-up to an election, and therefore the civic space, we hope, will get a bit bigger in that context.
The interactive dialogue, and the next speaker on my list is Botswana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Botswana wishes to thank the independent expert for his report on the situation of human rights in Mali. We commend the government of Mali for the cooperation with the independent expert and welcome the recent official visit by the independent expert in February 2023. The cooperation is important for the realization of human rights of people in that country. Botswana also takes note of the positive improvements in the security field, particularly the decline in the number of human rights violations and abuses, and the reduction in the number of internally displaced persons as reported by the independent expert. Despite the positive developments, we note with concern reports of the shrinking space of civic space violating the fundamental freedoms of expression and opinion and of the press. We therefore support the call by the independent expert on the Malian authorities to take all appropriate measures to prevent acts of violence or incitement to violence and to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable. In conclusion, Botswana recognizes the need for sustained international support for the restoration of peace and stability in Mali, including by the African Union, ECOWAS, and the MINUSMA. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now a pre-recorded video statement by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
President, UNHCR appreciates the reports of the independent expert on the situation of human rights in Mali, highlighting the dramatic increase in IDPs and supports the recommendations to the Malian government to make sub-regional cooperation more robust. UNHCR invokes the UN High Commissioner for Refugees' call for the total commitment of the international community to end statelessness. In that regard, UNHCR congratulates the Republic of Mali, who is a party to the Statelessness Conventions, for the significant milestones achieved, including the action plan to combat statelessness specifically for the naturalization of children born of Mauritanian refugees. 4 pledges towards eradicating statelessness made at the high-level segment on statelessness in May 2020, and the decree implementing the law on nationality to facilitate the naturalization process. UNHCR will strengthen its collaboration with the government of Mali to facilitate the naturalization of protracted refugees, identify people at risk of statelessness, and to support the prevention of statelessness in Mali. UNHCR is reopening its field office in Kai to accompany the Malian authorities in intensifying efforts to reduce statelessness and provide a durable solution. UNHCR is concerned and committed to working with the government of Mali to end the 33 years of statelessness affecting over 14,000 Mauritanians who were denationalized by Mauritania in April 1989. And whose statelessness was passed on to 3 generations of their descendants who have been living in exile in Mali. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And now let me invite Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President, my delegation wishes to thank the independent expert for his report on the human rights situation in Mali. Thinking firstly about the security context, and in particular about groups based in Niger that are active in Mali. Here we note that in the report the expert refers to a number of such instances. I would like to specify that we do not recognize the existence of any such groupings in the territory of Niger. When it comes to human rights, however, we do wish to commend the manifest will of the authorities in Mali to cooperate with all mechanisms that exist. And we have, for instance, ECOWAS, the UA, MINUSMA, and many independent experts who are working together, some of them within the framework of the Transition Council and its cooperation mechanisms. We commend also the adoption of laws and regulations on steps to be taken to combat violations that are very serious when it comes to human rights and ensure that they are punished. We also commend the work done by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and we think all of this shows that despite the many obstacles that terrorist groupings pose in the country, progress is being made. As for the transition timeline and promulgation of the electoral law, here we see that an independent authority has been set up to manage the elections. We also see that a draft constitution has been prepared, and this also shows commitment.
The floor. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we would like to welcome the delegation from Mali. Australia thanks the independent expert for his report. We remain deeply concerned by the ongoing violence and instability in Mali, particularly its impact on women and children. We urge the Malian authorities to strengthen the rule of law. It is crucial that all violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law are fully investigated. Perpetrators of crimes, including human rights abuses committed against civilians by security forces and armed non-state groups, must be brought to justice. We urge the Malian authorities to maintain its timetable for a return to democratic elections in 2024 and ensure they will be held in an atmosphere free of threats and intimidation. Australia urged the Malian authorities to adopt legal mechanisms to protect children, combat child marriage, and take steps to eliminate the practice of female genital mutilation. Australia asks what progress has and can be made to reduce the disproportionate impacts of conflict on children in Mali. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is Russian Federation.
President, we note Mali's efforts to stabilize its internal political situation, to resolve acute socio-economic issues, and to hold elections at all levels between now and February next year. In conditions of transition, we see that there are challenges with human rights, and progress is being hindered by the activities of certain terrorist groups. We regret the fact that the UK, Germany and Sweden have decided to withdraw their peacekeeping contingents. That does not give grounds for optimism. The plans of France to stop financing assistance programs also does not help, given the fact that 2 million people there need food assistance. We regret the efforts to discredit Mali that we have heard here from Benelux, the EU, the US, the UK and others who talk about abuses committed by the forces of Mali, supposedly with Russian instructors. We refute these allegations most strongly. And we can assure you that all Russians there are there on the basis of bilateral agreement, and they focus only on the tasks they have been allocated. We are convinced that in this situation we need to help the Mali authorities, and we will continue to do so by supporting them within their law enforcement agency development, and also in seeking to assist them in overcoming the negative effects of the food and energy crisis.
By the delegation of Chad via Zoom.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Chad wishes to welcome most warmly the delegation of the Republic of Mali, and we thank the independent expert for his statement on the human rights situation in Mali. We align ourselves with the declaration made by the group to which we belong. Like many others, the delegation of Chad is concerned by the complexity of the security situation in Mali that is marked by attacks on civilians, MINUSMA, as well as defense and security forces, and there are extremist, violent groups involved. We also welcome positive developments within the transition government to move towards restoring constitutional order by adopting a timeline for transition with various steps to be taken between now and the elections. We commend the measures taken by the government of Mali as part of giving effect to recommendations accepted during its third UPR cycle. We therefore encourage the government to continue to support locally based peace initiatives to prevent conflict, to mediate and to resolve conflicts, to develop dialogue and reconciliation, including traditional mechanisms for peace building and peace consolidation. This will allow Mali to achieve lasting peace. In conclusion, we strongly support the recommendations from the independent expert, and we urge the government of Mali and its partners to ensure that the geopolitical and geostrategic slippage in the country does not worsen political tension in the region, rather that they work together to enhance peace, stability and security in Mali.
Ireland, you had the floor.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the independent expert for his report. Ireland remains deeply concerned by the deteriorating security and human rights situation in Mali. In particular, the increase in internally displaced persons and the number of school closures generated by insecurity will bear long-term consequences for the people of Mali. The culture of impunity for human rights violations and abuses committed by a variety of actors, including national security forces, remains a significant challenge. Ireland calls upon the Malian authorities to bring to justice all perpetrators of violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. The shrinking of civic space and constraints on freedom of expression, including growing levels of self-censorship and reported attacks against human rights defenders, are deeply worrying and foster an environment conducive to impunity. The decision to declare the director of the Human Rights Division of the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali persona non grata is also deeply worrying. Ireland echoes the independent experts' concerns regarding the impact of the crisis in Mali on the rights of women and girls, in particular the documented increase in gender-based violence, and calls on the Malian authorities to take action to protect the rights of women and girls, including by proactively addressing gender-based violence. In your opinion, how can the international community best encourage the Malian authorities to address human rights violations and abuses and improve accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last country on my list is France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President, I thank the independent expert for his report on the human rights situation in Mali. And allow me first and foremost to say that France is really bewildered by the difficulties he encountered when he visited Mali in February. That's something that we deplore. The episode really shows that things are getting beyond the control of the transition authorities and that human rights protection is seriously in jeopardy there. And I wish to commend what has been done by the MINUSMA Human Rights Division, which has highlighted some of these issues. We are deeply concerned by serious human rights violations, murders, rapes, attacks. We see theft of property and cattle, many things that are being done by terrorist groups. And also we note what is being done by the Russian Wagner mercenaries, who also kill, abuse and rape. We would call upon the authorities to protect civil space in the country because we see that it is constantly under threat and it is shrinking. We believe we need to have an independent expert into all abuses committed by the authorities and by Wagner. All that has been done is very, very serious, especially if you look at what happened in Moura more than a year ago. We owe it to all of the victims to investigate. Thank you.
And we will continue with the list of NGOs. And the first on my list is Centre Indépendant de Recherche et d'Initiative pour le Dialogue.
The transitional authorities are trying to draw up a constitution in a speedy, undemocratic way, giving more powers to the president, and this will lead to great authoritarianism. We want a constitutional government which respects traditional authorities on the basis of the 1235 Kurunkanfuga Charter. There should be a transition of 2 to 3 years. A constituent assembly should elect the authorities, and the parliament should elect a transitional government which is neutral and collegial. The cultural and linguistic rights should be restored. There should be an honorary president for a one-year non-renewable mandate, and there should be a commander-in-chief who is elected in order to fight against terrorists. Thank you.
So 5 video statements, first by Anti-Slavery International.
Anti-Slavery International welcomes this report and thanks the independent expert for spotlighting descent-based slavery in Mali, where people are still born into slavery without civil status and where there's no law specifically criminalizing the practice. We regret that Mr. Tine's mission took place in a context marred by the shrinking of civic space and welcome his finding that efforts are underway to prosecute around 100 people involved in human rights abuses related to slavery. We highlight that thanks to the untiring efforts of civil society led by our partner Temet since 2015, a law to criminalize slavery is now in its final phase. The current draft is broadly consultative and draws on regional practice. We now urge the transitional government to ensure that this landmark draft is adopted without further delay, without being weakened. This requires vigilance. As several UN experts, including Mr. Tine, have stressed, descent-based slavery is still socially accepted by some influential politicians, traditional leaders, law enforcement officials, and judicial authorities in Mali. To ensure full implementation of the law, we therefore call for the government to identify all people experiencing descent-based slavery, provide them with civil status and comprehensive protection and support, take steps to prevent further violence and reprisals against them and human rights defenders, deliver a national awareness programme that combats discriminatory attitudes against them, and collect data on the prevalence of slavery in Mali. Independent expert, how do you now envision progress on tackling descent-based slavery in Mali?
Centre du Commerce International pour le Développement is the next.
We'd like to thank the independent expert for his work on the human rights situation in Mali and the Malian delegation for taking part today. Mali is epitomised by high insecurity for civilians. We're disturbed at human rights violations there, including violations of civil and political rights, acts of torture, arbitrary detention and sexual violence. We call upon the Malian authorities to crack down on serious human rights violations. Civilians can't continue to bear the brunt of political instability and the security situation. With this in mind, we hail Mali's adoption of rules on reparation for human rights violations. This must be implemented swiftly so that perpetrators are brought to book. We encourage Mali to strengthen cooperation with the Council and other multilateral mechanisms such as MINUSMA and ECOWAS. Lastly, CECID denounces restrictions and pressure on local and foreign media. We call upon Mali to ensure the freedom of expression and press freedom. Thank you very much.
Sorry. And the next video is by International Federation for Human Rights Leaks.
We thank Mr. Aliountines for his constant attention to Mali, as well as the information given by the Foreign Minister this morning. We're concerned by the escalation of human rights violations, impunity for their perpetrators, and the shrinking civil and democratic space for human rights defenders. The sound is inaudible for the interpreters, and interpretation will be suspended.
Ouverte sur des cas de violation grave des droits humains pourtant sans suite ni résultat probant, excepté dans les procédures antiterroristes. S'agissant de l'espace civique, la FIDH dénonce les nombreuses restrictions aux libertés d'expression, de baisse d'association, de manifestation depuis le coup d'État militaire de mai 2021. La FIDH appelle ainsi le Conseil des droits de l'homme à appeler les autorités maliennes à garantir en toutes circonstances l'intégrité physique et le bien-être psychologique de l'ensemble des défenseurs des droits humains, procéder à la libération des défenseurs arbitrairement détenus. Demander le renforcement du soutien de l'ONU aux autorités maliennes pour renforcer la protection des populations civiles et lutter contre l'impunité. Contribuer à soutenir pleinement la participation régulière et indépendante de la société civile malienne aux travaux des mécanismes des Nations Unies. Exhorter les autorités maliennes à adresser une invitation permanente au rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies.
Et maintenant, nous allons continuer.
We'll now continue with Rado. President Rado thanks Mr. Aliountines, the independent expert, for his report, and would like to congratulate him on his work since he started his mandate. We fully support that his mandate be renewed so Mali can be helped to finish the transition and restore the constitution. We recognise the authorities' efforts, notably through adopting a strategic plan, and MINUSMA's work to promote peace and the respect for human rights. But we're disturbed by the growing number of attacks by extremist groups and community defence forces against civilians in order to control land. Murders, abductions, torture and extrajudicial killings have plunged the north and centre into a climate of terror. We condemn the involvement of Malian armed forces in violence against civilians, as well as the enlistment of children into the army. We're shocked by the fact that since 2012, the various operations have never brought security to the country, and the insecurity is increasingly affecting the whole sub-region. We'd like to know how the independent experts suggest we could put a stop to internal armed conflict to ensure Mali and neighbouring countries' security.
Uploaded by Eliška Relief Foundation.
The Eliška Foundation appreciates the efforts of the independent expert on the situation and his visits to Mali, and shares his dissatisfaction with the continuing deterioration of human rights conditions at all levels, as well as its deep concern about the escalating repercussions of acts of violence, impunity, and the spread of armed groups. In terms of political and civil rights, and despite the adoption of the project to establish a National Directorate for Human Rights in February 2023, the submission of the draft of the new constitution and the activation of the National Elections Commission in October 2022, the entitlements of the elections and public participation are incomplete due to the absence of administrative committees in some municipalities and the failure to register the homeless, displaced persons, and refugees, in conjunction with the shrinking spaces for opinion, freedom of expression, personal security, and the right to life. In March 2022, security forces summarily executed over 300 detainees in Mora, central Mali. Mr. President, the Eliška Foundation recommends the independent expert in Mali to technically support the government by providing it with international judicial experts, to enable it conduct thorough and prompt investigations, to bring all perpetrators of gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law to justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me pass the floor to Interface International.
International félicite Monsieur.
Interfaith International congratulates Mr. Alioune for his remarkable work to improve human rights in Mali. We take this opportunity to pay tribute to Mr. Teen. You are a model for African civil society, sir. We thank you for your tireless efforts to promote peace in Casamance, in Senegal, as well as to promote good governance and fundamental freedoms in Africa. A former president and founder of RADO, you were an essential figure in preparing Africa for the World Conference on Racism in Durban. We hope that you will bring peace and constitutional order to Mali. It is the country which houses the Karakanfuga Charter as well as the Timbuktu Library, pillaged by extremists in 2012. We thank UNESCO for its huge contribution to restoring the library and historic monuments. We fully support the renewal of your mandate, sir, but we're concerned about restrictions on the freedom of the press, association, demonstrations, and the expulsion of foreign media. We're closely following extremism and fundamentalism in the Sahel, affecting Mali since the Libyan crisis. How can we put a stop to the Talibanization of the Sahel and West Africa, sir? Thank you.
During this interactive dialogue has been sent by Human Rights Research League.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Human Rights Research League est profondément préoccupé par la...
Thank you, Chair. We're deeply concerned at the ongoing serious human rights violations and those of international humanitarian law throughout Mali, often in impunity. In your report, sir, you describe that extremist groups continue to be the main perpetrators of violations. Around a third of infringements, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearance, torture, gender-based violence, nevertheless can still be attributed to Malian forces. Instead of recognizing these facts and searching for solutions, the Malian authorities continue to flatly deny all allegations of violations. What's worse, as you've pointed out, is that this deplorable behavior of systematic denial and the lack of true judicial prosecutions may make the potential perpetrators of human rights violations think that the Malian state protects them from prosecution, and so that they continue to do this in full impunity. So what can be done, sir, to break this cycle of impunity, which is growing? Thank you.
And since it was the last speaker on my list, let me now give the floor back to Mr. Teen for his concluding remarks. Sir, you have approximately 7 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the main problem for Mali, which gives rise to all the others, is the security situation. It's quite clear that since 2012, no solution has been found to bring stability and security. In my opinion, it's not a Malian crisis. It is a regional crisis. So we can't find a solution at national level. And that's something that we have to reassess first of all. So there was this epicenter in 2012, but since then the crisis has spread to all the coastal countries, including Togo, Benin, and even Senegal now. So I think that we have to reassess our global security strategy in order to strengthen stability. We have to acknowledge that the Malian army has changed between 2012 and 2013. There have been considerable improvements, and we've had some frank discussions with the army on this. So the means are there, but there are limits, and we have to examine them so we can see exactly what Africans can do. And that's where I'd like to turn to cooperation and ties with others. We have to see to what extent African cooperation and African initiatives supported by the international community can bring stability, lasting stability, so that we combat terrorism in Mali together. I think that if we use the current schemes, we'll be having the same discussions 20 years from now. So we have to have a true rethink. We cannot politicize this. We know that there is this geopolitical upheaval at the moment, and the effects of that are being felt in Mali, but throughout the ECOWAS region and in Africa as a whole. So there are a number of questions that I wanted to emphasize. That's why I've spoken about these cooperation ties. How can Mali build a state in all loyalty without a hidden agenda? How can human rights be waved as a flag, as a flagship project without politicization? Now, when it comes to children, what can we do to protect them? I'm pleased to tell you that during my last visit, I held a dialogue with members of the government in the Ministry of Justice. The Minister of Education was present, and I spoke to him about protecting children and the closure of schools. Now, that's a time bomb if you close down schools, because if you've got young people who can't go to school, who can't get an education, then you are just building a time bomb for later down the line. And the Minister of Education told me that efforts had been deployed in order to make certain schools safe so that they can be reopened. But what can the international community do to help in this, to strengthen the protection of children and schools? So overall, the situation needs to improve. But you can't, as I say, solve a regional crisis at national level. We need everyone to work together. I have to say that I'm perplexed by this situation at the moment. In the center of Mali, when I visited the region, I had 3 or 4 armored vehicles in front of me and behind me. But I used to go with just 1 car accompanying me. How did we get to this situation? Well, this is because we have to have the communities talking to each other and solving their problems. So we have to have these local efforts of people solving their problems. They must be supported by development actors. And I think that we need coordination on the security response. And that security response must also provide solutions for development. And we have seen the first signs of recovery and development in the center of Mali. That's the first thing that I wanted to say in response to your questions. So the essential problem is to bring security and stability to Mali. If you do that, then security and stability will spread throughout the sub-region. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, this is the end of this interactive dialogue, and let me thank Mr. Tine on your behalf and on my behalf for his participation today. We will now take a short break, and we will continue swiftly with the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the findings of the OHCHR report on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now hold the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the findings of the OHCHR. Please, colleagues, could you leave the room if you don't want to stay here for the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner? Please. We've started already our debate and we are disturbing the deliberations of the Council. I thank you for your understanding and I ask the security actually to step in. Thank you. So let me start again. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now hold the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the findings of the OHCHR report on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. The dialogue was mandated by the Council Resolution 47/22. It is my honor to welcome here Mr. Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes, and it's my pleasure to give the floor to the High Commissioner for his presentation. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine has thrown us back to an archaic era, an era when a neighboring country's territory could be attacked and taken at will as one's own, when the identity and history of communities could be denied and reality rewritten. The UN Charter was supposed to put an end to such atavistic thinking, but today a nation is struggling to survive. After 13 months of the Russian Federation's war against Ukraine, severe violations of human rights and international humanitarian law have become shockingly routine. People across the country face massive suffering and loss, deprivation, displacement and destruction. And the continuing worldwide effects of this war, including on countries without any kind of involvement, are profound. Mr. President, using the rigorous methodology of my office, our staff have verified more than 8,400 civilian deaths and over 14,000 civilians wounded since 20 February of last year. These figures are just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the casualties resulted from the Russian forces' use of wide-impact explosive weaponry in residential neighborhoods. In occupied areas of Ukraine, we have documented numerous summary executions and targeted attacks on civilians since February last year by Russia's military forces, including affiliated armed groups such as the Wagner Group. We have also documented 621 cases of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention. Interviews with 89 civilians released from detention indicated that 91% of them were tortured or ill-treated by Russian personnel, including through various forms of sexual violence. 5 of the victims of enforced disappearance were boys, one only 14 years old. All 5 of these children were tortured or ill-treated. Of the 109 cases of sexual violence by Russian personnel that were documented, most took place in places of detention. Others, including rape, were perpetrated in areas controlled by Russian forces, mostly against women. 3 rape victims were girls under the age of 18. During the same period, my staff have documented 91 cases of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention by Ukrainian security forces. Of the 73 victims we interviewed, 53% had been tortured or ill-treated. We registered 24 cases of sexual violence by Ukrainian personnel. Most of these consisted of threats of sexual violence during initial stages of detention, as well as forced public stripping. Ukrainian civilians have been transferred to occupied territory or to the Russian Federation. They include children and adults who had been housed in social care institutions, as well as unaccompanied children living in areas of Ukraine occupied or temporarily controlled by Russian forces. These transfers may constitute violations of Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention, which prohibits forcible transfers to occupied territory or deportations to any other country, regardless of their motive. 2 weeks ago, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine told this Council in sobering detail about the serious violations of international law it had identified over the last year, including war crimes and even possible crimes against humanity. The Council is also aware that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for alleged war crimes of unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Mr. President, more than 400 prisoners of war on both sides have been interviewed by my staff. Ukraine, to its credit, provided unfettered and confidential access to places of internment. The Russian Federation, however, gave us no access, despite multiple requests, meaning that interviews with Ukrainian prisoners of war could take place only after they had been released. This lack of access also means that number of cases ought not to be compared against each other. More than 90% of Ukrainian prisoners of war that my office interviewed said that they were tortured or ill-treated, notably in penitentiary facilities, including through so-called, it's an awful word, welcoming beatings on their arrival, as well as frequent acts of torture throughout detention. We documented the deaths of 5 prisoners of war from injuries sustained during torture in internment. Food and access to medical care was grossly inadequate. It is essential that international monitors and the staff of our human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine receive unfettered access to all individuals detained by Russian forces. Almost half of the Russian POWs who were interviewed indicated that they had been tortured or ill-treated. Most of these acts of torture reportedly occurred soon after capture. We did not find a sustained pattern of severe ill-treatment in more permanent places of internment. We documented the summary execution by Russian personnel of Ukrainian prisoners of war shortly after their capture, with one victim severely mutilated before he was killed. Ukrainian prisoners of war who were captured during battle were also frequently tortured or ill-treated, with at least one such prisoner of war dying within hours of his torture. We also continue to gather and analyze information about the devastating incident in Olenivka in July 2022, in which at least 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed. We documented the summary execution by Ukrainian armed forces of Russian prisoners of war and personnel hors de combat immediately following their capture. We are aware of ongoing investigations by the Ukrainian authorities, but not to date of any prosecutions. Mr. President, international humanitarian law encapsulates minimum core values that, in the most distressing of circumstances, preserve our humanity. Even amidst the bloodshed of war, the rules of international humanitarian law especially protect the lives and dignity of civilians, wounded and sick soldiers and prisoners of war. Nobody is above these laws. Civilians and key civilian infrastructure may not be targeted. Medical and humanitarian personnel must be permitted to work unimpeded. It is forbidden deliberately to kill or wound an adversary who has surrendered or who can no longer take part in fighting. The fundamental human rights of prisoners of war must be respected. The use of weapons or tactics that are likely to cause unnecessary death or excessive suffering is prohibited. And yet, for the woman with disabilities who is unable to leave her house under heavy shelling, for the tens of thousands whose lives and bodies are being torn apart, for prisoners of war who are tortured and deprived of medical care, for children growing up in terror, these laws are violated daily. I speak for many when I say that I will never forget the photographs of a dying, heavily pregnant woman being carried on a stretcher from the bombed-out ruins of Mariupol Maternity Hospital in March 2022. All these victims have a right to justice and to a just peace. Russia's war on Ukraine continues to send shockwaves across the world. Sharp increases in the prices of food, energy, fertilizers, and other essential commodities have heightened tensions and inequalities in every region. The most severe global cost of living crisis in a generation is harming the lives and livelihoods of an estimated 1.6 billion people. It has pushed more than 71 million people into poverty. It threatens the stability of many countries. It is essential to the lives of tens of millions of people around the world that the Black Sea Grain Initiative continue to provide support to global food security, well beyond the current cut-off point in May 2023. 37 years, almost to the day, since the Chernobyl disaster, another Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia continues to be placed at enormous risk, with potential impact on millions of people within and outside the country. At a time when humanity faces overwhelming existential challenges, this destructive war is tugging us away from the work of building solutions, the work of ensuring our survival. This war defies any reason. This madness must end and peace be found in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. My office, my colleagues, my teams will continue to do our utmost to monitor, document and report the reality that is endured by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. Now, according to our usual practice, let me invite the delegation of the country concerned. Madam Ambassador, you have the floor and you have 5 minutes, please.
Mr. President, we wish to thank the High Commissioner for his statement, which provides a shocking picture of dire and continuous deterioration of human rights situation in my country. This Council has received on numerous occasions undeniable evidence that the only root cause of the human rights violations of Ukrainian people since 2014 has been a mother of all crimes, an unjustified and unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Aggression that has been unequivocally condemned by the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council and many international organizations. This is exactly the supreme international crime that has led to other atrocity crimes, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity. Many of these crimes have explicit signs of genocide. Ukraine will continue to pursue efforts towards the establishment of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian political and military leadership for the crime of aggression. For the second year, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues to inflict on my country and its population unconscionable violence and destruction and unspeakable human suffering. Russia's persisting heinous attacks against residential buildings, schools, medical facilities, critical infrastructure, deliberate targeting of civilians or civilian objects, willful killings, torture, rape, unlawful transfers and deportations have become a hallmark of Russia's terror against Ukraine. Russian brutality in its most barbaric forms is manifested in the inhumane treatment of the Ukrainian prisoners of war, who are subjected to torture and executions through violent beatings, electrocution, strangulation, sexual violence, or torture by fire. Mr. President, no child shall ever live through the horrors as those inflicted on the Ukrainian children by the Russian occupiers. We believe that the arrest warrants issued by the ICC for Putin and Lvova Belova for the unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children from occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia is an important legal step towards holding aggressor state to account for the most serious international crimes committed against Ukraine. The territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia, including certain areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson regions and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, without international access, remain black holes where people are completely deprived of their basic rights and freedom and are subject to persecution for their resistance to foreign occupation. We have taken note of the information on the alleged violation from the Ukrainian side and the recommendations in the reports, which will be closely examined with a view to take necessary action in line of national legislation and international obligations of Ukraine. Even in the face of aggression, Ukraine remains committed to its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and looks forward to continuing open and constructive cooperation with relevant international mechanisms. Distinguished delegates, as High Commissioner noted today, the scope of documented Russia's atrocities in Ukraine is unfortunately just a tip of the iceberg of Russia's war crimes, as the established international human rights and humanitarian mechanisms continue to be denied access to Russian-occupied territory of Ukraine, which prevents them from assessing the real scale of Russia's atrocities and providing a comprehensive account of violations. We reiterate our demand for Russia to provide full and unimpeded access to the Ukrainian territories under its temporary military control for the existing human rights and humanitarian mechanisms so that they could fully implement their monitoring and investigating mandates. Today, the only way to halt Russia's crimes against the people in Ukraine and to save many human lives is for Ukraine to exercise its legal and moral right for self-defense under the UN Charter, with the support of the international community, and to ensure aggressors' defeat. We will also leave no stone unturned in our pursuit of accountability and justice, and it will be achieved in the name of millions of victims of the Russian aggression and in the name of human rights. I thank you.
I thank you, Madam Ambassador. Colleagues, the list of speakers is now closed, and now let me invite delegations to ask the questions to the High Commissioner and make comments on his presentation. The speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds, and let me start with the delegation of Estonia speaking on behalf of a group of countries. Estonia, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We thank the High Commissioner for the update and the continuous UNHRC's work on the ground. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has resulted in widespread terror and intolerable suffering with far-reaching consequences. We have witnessed images and reports on both indiscriminate and targeted attacks against civilians and civilian and critical energy infrastructure, as well as sexual and gender-based violence. Ukrainian children are paying a particularly high price for this brutal and unjustified war. More than 400 children have been killed, hundreds more injured, and over 7 million Ukrainian children are left without peaceful and happy childhood, having lost family members, homes, schools or playgrounds. Moreover, numerous children have been systematically put through filtration camps and forcibly transferred within Ukraine and deported to Russia, many of them separated from parents and illegally adopted. As the Commission of Inquiry clearly stated, these forced transfers and deportations amount to war crimes. We reiterate that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes and do everything to hold Russia fully accountable for war crimes and other grave violations of international law. The ICC's decision to issue arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, is an important step towards accountability. High Commissioner, how can we best support the fight against impunity? I thank you.
Thank you, and I pass the floor to the European Union.
Mr. President, many thanks to the High Commissioner for his update. We thank the Office for its recent reports on the human rights situation in Ukraine and the issue of the treatment of prisoners of war. We share the High Commissioner's dismay over the scale of destruction and magnitude of civilian casualties as a result of Russia's brutal, unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. This violation of international law, including the UN Charter, has caused immense suffering to the people of Ukraine, a sovereign and independent country, as well as to people around the world, and challenged the entire rules-based international order. The victims and survivors of Russia's war of aggression and of the atrocity crimes committed on Ukrainian soil have a right to justice and to reparations. the EU continues to support all accountability efforts. Mr. High Commissioner, could you elaborate on the findings that your office has made on the forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to territories temporarily under Russian military control and to Russia? Could you also possibly address the growing evidence of sexual and gender-based violence being used, including against prisoners of war and as a broader military tactic by Russia? Mr. President, the European Union will continue to work with Ukraine on its 10-point peace plan and will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. The EU remains unwavering in its support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as its pursuit of accountability.
Thank you. And now let me pass the floor to Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. We appreciate the work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and thank the High Commissioner for the oral update. For more than 1 year, for more than 400 days of Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, we are witnessing wide-scale destruction of Ukraine's cities, deliberate attacks against civilians, as well as civilian and critical energy infrastructure. The OHCHR's report documented thousands of civilian casualties, as well as shocking brutality of Russian officers, including torture, sexual violence and willful killing of Ukrainian prisoners of war in full disregard of the Geneva Conventions. We strongly condemn all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, especially war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Furthermore, we call for an immediate return of all Ukrainian children that have been forcibly transferred to Russia. Ensuring full accountability for Russia's crimes in Ukraine, including for the crime of aggression, is the top priority. The OHCHR's work on the ground, as well as the investigation carried out by the Commission of Inquiry, are key in that regard. Meticulous documentation of crimes and the identification of the exact individuals who committed them is crucial in ensuring justice to victims. Mr. High Commissioner, how could we facilitate the efforts to identify individual perpetrators? Thank you.
Thank you. And we continue with Liechtenstein.
President, Liechtenstein, we thank first of all the High Commissioner for his excellent report. Liechtenstein remains deeply concerned about the continuing reports of systematic and serious violations of international humanitarian law by the Russian armed forces, including attacks on medical and educational facilities, which are in a violation of the right to health and the right to education of millions of Ukrainians. Equally worrying are the accounts of torture, ill treatment and summary executions of prisoners of war. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect and ensure respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Every state has an obligation to investigate potentially unlawful deaths. This obligation does not cease to exist in situations of armed conflict. On the contrary, after an attack, there is an obligation to search for the missing and the dead and to identify the deceased. The recording of casualties is crucial to ensure that the human rights of those deceased and their relatives and loved ones are respected, as well as for future accountability purposes. Liechtenstein condemns in the strongest possible terms the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. Such threats are unacceptable anytime by anyone. And to conclude, I'd like to reiterate Liechtenstein's solidarity, of course, with Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Thank you. Sovereign Order of Malta, you have the floor.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, the Sovereign Order of Malta thanks the High Commissioner for his update and shares his conclusions. Since more than a year now, we deplore the ongoing war in Ukraine and have appealed to all parties to respect international humanitarian and human rights law. The Order of Malta has been engaged from the outset in an important humanitarian action to alleviate the enormous human suffering of the people in Ukraine and of the refugees in neighboring countries. Malteser International, together with our national entities and partners, have delivered more than 6,100 tons of basic humanitarian aid in about 65 Ukrainian cities, built shelters for housing IDPs, restored 130 houses in the most affected regions, and handed nearly 500 generators. In order to improve the mental health of the affected population, psychological assistance is provided in safe spaces and benefited until now 8,800 people. We also equipped the emergency hospital in Lviv with a prosthesis laboratory where already numerous patients have been fitted with prostheses. Furthermore, 2,122 people were trained in first aid. Our humanitarian assistance focuses on the respect of human rights. In this spirit, the Order of Malta is determined to pursue its action as long as necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm passing the floor to Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. Ireland also reiterates its condemnation of Russia's illegal and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We remain concerned by the impact that Russia's war of choice continues to have on civilians, causing over 22,000 civilian casualties and mass displacement both internally and across Europe. We are gravely concerned by the forcible transfer and deportation of children from Ukraine, as well as illegal adoption of Ukrainian children. We note the decision of the ICC to issue arrest warrants against the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and the Commissioner for Children's Rights in the Office of the President, Maria Lvova-Belova, in connection with these alleged crimes. This decision is an important step, we believe, towards ensuring accountability for all perpetrators for serious violations of international law, including for crimes and atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine. Ireland once again calls on Russia to end this war and to withdraw its forces from within the internationally recognised borders of Ukraine, and Ireland will continue to make this call across multilateral fora. High Commissioner, how can the international community support persons with disabilities and older persons, given that they are particularly vulnerable in situations of armed conflict and displacement? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm inviting now the Czech Republic.
Thank you. The Czech Republic aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his presentation and express our support to the work of his office and the monitoring mission in Ukraine. The whole world continues to witness unspeakable suffering by the people in Ukraine, unleashed by Russia's war of aggression. Civilians remain under brutal attack by the Russian armed forces. Their homes are bombed and critical infrastructure systematically struck. Evidence of willful killings, systematic and widespread torture, and unlawful transfers of civilians continues to mount. It is highly alarming to see the devastating impact on millions of children, having lost their families, if not their own life, lacking the access to basic needs and education, with many subjected to ongoing large-scale deportations, torture, and other atrocities by Russian forces. We welcome the ongoing investigations, including the recent ICC's arrest warrants. We will not relent in urging Russia to stop its war. We also urge Russia to start fully cooperating with all international investigative mechanisms, including by granting them unimpeded access to all prisoners of war and detainees. Peace and justice must and will prevail. High Commissioner, how has your office been addressing the existing allegations of genocide committed in Ukraine? I thank you.
President, thank you, High Commissioner, for using your voice in such a powerful way today, and to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission for your critical work. Based on a careful analysis of the law and available facts, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken determined that members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials have committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. They have committed execution-style killings of Ukrainian men, women, and children, tortured civilians in detention through beatings, electrocution, and mock executions, committed rape, and alongside other Russian officials, systematically deported hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians to Russia, including children who have been forcibly separated from their parents. These acts are not random or spontaneous. They are part of the Kremlin's widespread and systematic attack against Ukraine's civilian population. We also condemn reports of horrific mistreatment of prisoners of war. Russia must stop its war. Russia's forces and officials must halt their crimes and abuses. All those responsible must be held accountable. I would like to ask how the international community can help protect the most vulnerable in light of Russia's attacks on civilians and forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainians. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement, and we would like to thank the High Commissioner for its update and the Human Rights Monitoring Mission for their tireless efforts. Let me assure you that politically and financially, Germany remains a steadfast supporter of the mission. Russia has sent the world into turmoil. Its war of aggression against Ukraine is not only a war against a sovereign state, but also a violation of our most fundamental values and principles, causing a global food, energy and finance crisis. Its effects are felt around the world, but particularly by the most vulnerable, especially in Ukraine. The loss of lives, widespread destruction, atrocities, sexual and gender-based violence remain shocking. The members of this Council will not turn a blind eye on the human rights situation in Ukraine. The spirit of resistance of the Ukrainian people is inspiring and admirable. At the end, justice will prevail and perpetrators will be held to account. Mr. High Commissioner, as access by Russia to temporarily occupied areas remains highly restricted, how does the HRMMU gather independent and verifiable information in these regions? I do thank you.
Thank you. And now let me pass the floor to Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Portugal aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his oral update, his office for the reports, and the monitoring mission for its work. From February 22 to March 23, the office recorded over 22,000 civilian casualties. There are also credible and documented reports of arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, deportations, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, forced conscription and ill treatment of prisoners of war. These are clear violations of the Geneva Conventions and of international humanitarian and human rights law. These violations cannot go unpunished. Accountability is essential. War crimes must be prosecuted in respect for due process, and victims' rights to truth and remedy must be ensured. Mr. High Commissioner, you can count on Portugal's support to your office's independent and impartial work to continue to monitor all human rights violations and abuses in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Japan.
We appreciate the High Commissioner's briefing on the dire human rights situation in Ukraine. Over this Human Rights Council, we have had a number of occasions to collectively address and condemn the devastating impact of Russian aggression, a clear violation of international law on the large number of civilians in Ukraine. Last week, our Prime Minister visited Ukraine and witnessed the devastation and heard directly from those who had experienced the atrocities caused by Russian outrageous acts, which have shaken the very foundation of the international order. Japan remains appalled by the fact that a large number of civilians in Ukraine have been killed as a result of the action of the Russian forces. Japan also reiterates its condemnation of Russian attacks against critical infrastructure. Indiscriminate attacks on innocent civilians, a grave breach of international humanitarian law, are unacceptable and cannot be allowed. Japan continues to condemn such acts of aggression by Russia in the strongest terms, standing firmly with Ukraine and its people who, despite the dire situation, are fighting to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Japan will continue to do its utmost to stop the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine in collaboration with the international community. I thank you.
Thank you. China, you have the floor.
主席先生，中方关于乌克兰问题的立场是一贯的，即各国主权和领土完整都应该得到遵守，都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。在乌克兰问题上，对抗冲突不符合各方利益，大多数国家都支持缓和紧张局势，主张劝和促谈，反对火上浇油。这种情况下，中方坚决反对将人权问题政治化，反对借人权问题对别国施压，不赞成任何激化矛盾、加剧对抗、导致地区局势进一步紧张的做法。中方愿在关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中国立场文件基础上， 同国际社会一道，继续为推动乌克兰危机政治解决发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席先生。
Thank you. And now let me invite Cyprus.
Mr. President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement. The impact of hostilities on the civilian population is deeply concerning. Evidence is mounting on summary executions and attacks on individual civilians by Russian armed forces and the pervasive use of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances. The unbearable human cost of the war is also evident in the cases of gender-based and conflict-related sexual violence. What is more, the report documents transfer of civilians, including children, from Ukrainian territory, some of which may amount to forced transfers or deportations and hence violate IHL. These findings highlight once again the need for all perpetrators to be held accountable and for victims and their relatives to enjoy and be given a viable avenue to pursue the right to truth. The prosecution of persons responsible for committing grave violations of IHL will be a clear signal to all perpetrators in all conflicts that they too will be held accountable. Mr. High Commissioner, what can the international community do to further promote accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. France, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour votre présentation et réitère son soutien au mandat de la mission de surveillance. Nous réitérons notre absolue condamnation de l'agression illégale lancée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine au mépris de la Charte et du droit international. Les violations systématiques et massives des droits de l'homme commises par la Russie et ses supplétifs de Wagner sont documentées. Les meurtres de civils, les transferts forcés et déportations d'enfants, si graves que le mécanisme de l'OSCE a dû être activé. Les viols et les violences sexuelles ne resteront pas impunis. L'usage systématique de la torture, les attaques de la Russie contre les infrastructures énergétiques de l'Ukraine relèvent de violations massives et délibérées des conventions de Genève. Ces exactions systématiques, délibérées, témoignent du mépris des autorités russes à l'égard de la vie humaine et des souffrances qu'elles infligent à la population ukrainienne. Elles sont constitutives de crimes de guerre et de crimes contre l'humanité. La France a pris note comme un développement de la plus haute importance de l'émission par la Cour pénale internationale de mandat d'arrêt contre le président de la Fédération Russie et la commissaire russe pour les droits de l'enfant. Elle appuie résolument l'indispensable travail de la Cour et des juridictions ukrainiennes pour que les responsables de tous les crimes commis en Ukraine rendent des comptes. La France se tient et se tiendra aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra aux côtés de l'Ukraine. Elle soutient la formule de paix proposée par le président Zelensky qui propose un chemin vers une paix juste et durable. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Latvia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Latvia lies with a statement on behalf of the European Union and Nordic Baltic. Thank you to the UNHRC for the oral update on Ukraine. More than 1 year has passed since Russia started its unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia has since openly chosen a path of violence and utter disrespect of its international obligations, unable to defeat Ukraine on that battlefield. Russia is attacking civilian and civilian infrastructure, trying to erase Ukraine as an independent and sovereign state. A special place in Russia's evil plan is reserved for the Ukrainian children. Thousands of them have been forcibly deported to Russia and transferred within the occupied territories placed the so-called education camp in order to erase their Ukrainian identity. Last week we remembered those more than 40,000 Latvian residents who were deported to Siberia by the Soviet regime 74 years ago. 1/4 of them were children. Today, Russia repeated the same atrocity in the Ukraine. Latvia welcomes the decision of the International Criminal Court to issue arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. There is no impunity of those who break international law, and justice must prevail. In conclusion, allow me to affirm Latvia's unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next country on my list is Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne.
Permettez-moi de remercier le haut-commissaire pour sa mise à jour orale ainsi que son bureau pour la préparation des 2 récents rapports sur la situation des droits humains en Ukraine et sur le traitement des prisonniers de guerre dans le contexte de l'agression russe. Respecter le droit international humanitaire n'est pas une question de choix, c'est une obligation. La protection des prisonniers de guerre et des personnes hors de combat en fait partie intégrante. Je voudrais souligner que, dans ce contexte, l'engagement du bureau du procureur général de l'Ukraine de poursuivre toute violation du DIH dans le contexte de l'invasion russe. En même temps, la Russie n'a pas pris de tels engagements. En effet, la nature systématique des violations des droits humains et du droit international humanitaire par les forces russes en Ukraine, amplement documentée par le BHCDH et d'autres observateurs indépendants, laisse conclure que c'est un choix du Kremlin de mener une guerre qui est brutale et impitoyable en plus d'être illégale. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, compte tenu de l'important travail que votre mission effectue en Ukraine depuis 2014. Quelles sont les options pour qu'elle puisse avoir accès à l'entièreté du territoire internationalement reconnu de l'Ukraine, en particulier en Crimée et dans les autres régions temporairement occupées par la Russie? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. North Macedonia, you have the floor.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for the update on the human rights situation in Ukraine. Russia's war against Ukraine has caused heavy impact on lives of the people of Ukraine. In today's war-torn Ukraine, the human lives and human suffering are losing their meaning. Since April 14, 2014, the Office of the High Commissioner recorded more than 11,000 civilian deaths. The report of the Office clearly notes the devastating effect that the war continues to have on the civilian and civilian infrastructure, including power, educational and medical facilities. North Macedonia is appalled from the widespread attacks on Ukraine's healthcare system, the destruction of hospitals, clinics and ambulances that have put both patients and medical staff at risk. We are deeply concerned about the disruption of access to health systems, the delivery of critical healthcare services, the lack of adequate medical care and the movement restriction jeopardizing access to healthcare. In addition, many pharmacies have closed or are not supplied with sufficient medication, and many health professionals have fled conflict-affected areas, making it harder to access a doctor or receive specialized services. We urge the international community and the relevant organization to support the revitalization of the Ukraine's health system. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, ознакомились с содержанием докладов УКПЧ. Отмечаем сохраняющуюся недосказанность относительно преступлений украинской стороны. Авторы намеренно замалчивают масштабы жестокости украинских властей и военщины, а также нарушений ими прав человека и основных свобод. Даже в этих неполных докладах констатируются преследования и убийства Киевом так называемых изменников, случаи насильственных исчезновений и произвольных задержаний, в том числе детей, пытки и сексуальное насилие со стороны правоохранителей, бесчеловечные условия содержания задержанных, проблемы в области отправления правосудия на Украине, особенно в контексте судебного преследования захваченных российских военнослужащих. Управление зафиксировало 25 внесудебных казней и 113 случаев жестоких пыток украинцами, в том числе раненых российских военнопленных. Яркий пример – расстрел 11 сдавшихся в плен россиян в Макеевке в ноябре прошлого года. Реальные же цифры гораздо выше. ОКПЧ справедливо отмечает действия Киева по зажиму СМИ и дискриминации по языковому и религиозному признаку. Украинские спецслужбы проводят обыски в приходах и храмах канонической Украинской Православной Церкви, изымают церковную собственность, угрожают служителям культа. В этой связи обращаем внимание на недопустимую ситуацию с захватом Киево-Печорской лавры. Призываем УКПЧ продолжать уделять пристальное внимание и публично реагировать на преступные действия Киева. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. And now let me invite Canada.
Merci. Le Canada exprime sa gratitude pour le travail inlassable du haut-commissaire et son rapport d'aujourd'hui. La guerre d'agression de la Russie contre l'Ukraine a eu des conséquences dévastatrices sur la vie des enfants. Depuis l'invasion à grande échelle il y a plus d'un an, les enfants ont été déplacés, blessés, traumatisés et tués par les bombardements russes incessants. Le Canada est profondément préoccupé par les rapports supplémentaires sur la disparition et le transfert forcé d'enfants migrants ukrainiens vers la Russie. Telles actions sont interdites par plusieurs articles de la 4e Convention de Genève. Aujourd'hui, le gouvernement ukrainien affirme que plus de 16 000 enfants ont été déportés. Cette campagne d'enlèvement, de transfert et de rééducation dite politique est coordonnée de manière centralisée par le gouvernement fédéral russe et implique tous les niveaux du gouvernement. Les violations systématiques des droits fondamentaux des enfants, y compris par des actions délibérées pouvant être qualifiées de violations graves, de crimes de guerre ou de crimes contre l'humanité, doivent être arrêtés et les responsables tenus pleinement responsables. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, quel rôle votre bureau prévoit-il jouer dans la lutte contre cette atroce violation des droits des enfants? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Now let me pass the floor to Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. High Commissioner, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. Poland is extremely concerned about the situation of Ukrainians from territories currently under Russian occupation who are subjected to forcible deportation to Russia and placed in infiltration camps. We are also concerned about the human rights situation in the Russia-occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and alarmed by the persistent persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, including Crimean Tatars, of Ukrainians, of human rights defenders, and all those who express critical voices against the Russian occupiers. Poland, in the strongest possible terms, condemns Russia's deplorable policy of forcible transfers of Ukrainian children to its territory. We welcome the decision of the ICC pretrial chamber to issue arrest warrants against Mr. Vladimir Putin and Ms. Maria Lvova-Belova in connection with alleged crimes of unlawful deportation and unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia. Poland supports all measures to ensure full accountability for human rights violations perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. We call upon Russia to end its war of aggression by immediate and unconditional withdrawing of all its troops and military equipment from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. Mr. High Commissioner, what more can the international community do in order to ensure accountability for suspected perpetrators of human rights abuses? I thank you.
Thank you. Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is joining now via Zoom.
Gracias, presidente. Estamos en el tema 10 de la Agenda del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, que fue concebido para abordar la asistencia técnica y el fomento de la capacidad, contando siempre con el concurso del país concernido, para así contribuir a mejorar la situación de los derechos humanos en el terreno, en consonancia con los principios del diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de nuestras labores. La resolución que dio lugar a este diálogo bajo el tema 10 no está referida a la asistencia técnica y al fomento de la capacidad en materia de derechos humanos. Abona el camino a la politización y desnaturaliza el mandato que se nos ha confiado. Una vez más expresamos nuestra oposición a la utilización de los espacios de este Consejo para los fines contrarios por los cuales fueron concebidos, ya que esto incentiva la selectividad, la politización, los dobles estándares que socavan la credibilidad de este importante órgano de las Naciones Unidas. En tal sentido, debemos desterrar de nuestras labores las iniciativas politizadas que en nada contribuyen a la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Reiteremos, en cambio, nuestro compromiso con la promoción y protección de todos los derechos humanos universales, indivisibles, interdependientes, interrelacionados, incluido el derecho al desarrollo, con imparcialidad, objetividad y transparencia, y en estricto apego a los principios universales de respeto a la soberanía y a la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los Estados. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. Slovakia, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Slovakia aligns itself with the EU statement. And thank you, High Commissioner, for visiting Ukraine in December 2022 and sharing with us your first-hand impressions about the situation on the ground. We are grateful to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for putting on paper numerous facts, actually in 2 new reports from last week. Being in item 10, Slovakia is concerned that gross portion of human rights violations in Ukraine is attributable to the Russian Federation, that a year ago unleashed a war of aggression against Ukraine. Again, we strongly condemn this action and call on Russia to stop this senseless war. We regret that reports mentioned could not be completed because the monitoring mission is prohibited to do its job properly. We call on Russia to provide representatives of international organizations with full unhindered access to persons who have been transferred to Russia or areas controlled by Russia, including the access to prisoners of war. On the other hand, I wish to praise Ukrainian authorities that provided the mission with unimpeded confidential access to official places of internment of Russian prisoners of war. Mr. High Commissioner, earlier this session you said that peace is precious and it's fragile. It must be based on UN Charter and international law, including human rights law. In this connection, Slovakia welcomes and supports the peace formula of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. I thank you.
Thank you. Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner, for your report. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We continue to be outraged by the systematic and large-scale human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law committed by Russia and Ukraine. The Netherlands is particularly appalled by the mounting evidence which points to Russia's policy of forcibly transfer of Ukrainian children to territory under Russian control and their deportation to Russia proper, as well as their illegal adoption and forced naturalization. These children must be returned to Ukraine and be reunited with their homeland, their family and their loved ones. The latest developments in Ukraine underline the importance of combating impunity for international crimes and large-scale human rights violations and abuses. As such, the Netherlands is honored to host the International Center on the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression and supports the establishment of a register for war damages in The Hague. We also support the work of the International Criminal Court, and the recent warrants issued in the context of the war in Ukraine constitute a significant step towards accountability. Mr. High Commissioner, how can your office support the implementation of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine to establish a functioning mechanism for tracing family links and family reunifications for children transferred to the occupied territories of Ukraine and the Russian Federation? Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Republic of Moldova.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, so much has been said in this past year since Russia started brutally military aggression against Ukraine. And despite our collective efforts here in this room, across all UN fora and all over the world, innocent people continue to die as we are stricken by new attacks against civilian infrastructure in Zaporozhye, Slovyansk and many other places. With that being said, it is crucial in this period to address all human rights violations, including those that might seem less urgent, such as freedom of religion. As we approach the Easter holidays, we must acknowledge the significant impact the war inflicted upon the right to freedom of religion and belief. The destruction by Russian military forces of almost 500 religious sites, churches, mosques, synagogues, represents not only a gross violation of international law and human rights, but also a deep loss for the individuals and communities who rely on places of worship, particularly during Easter season. We would like to refer to the continuous military attacks by the Russian Federation on the energy infrastructure, including the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which lost power for the 6th time following the shelling earlier this month. It is a matter of great concern for the entire community, Republic of Moldova included. Republic of Moldova strongly condemns military attacks on this kind of infrastructure, particularly those that pose a threat to civilian population, and we urge the Russian Federation to avoid any actions that could lead to even greater disaster. All violations must stop and those responsible held accountable. Republic of Moldova will...
And now let me invite Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the EU statement. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for the update and reiterate our full support to the work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We remain gravely concerned by cases of killings, enforced disappearances, conflict-related sexual violence, forced transfers and deportation, forced conscription, torture and other ill treatment of prisoners of war, as well as significant restrictions to civil and political rights and the broad impact of the armed conflict on the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights across society. While we understand that OHCHR has not been able to assess compliance with international humanitarian law for each individual incident, the patterns, frequency, scale and severity of civilian casualties and of destruction of and damage to civilian objects, including hospitals and schools, strongly indicate that recurring violations of international humanitarian law have taken place. These crimes must not go unpunished, perpetrators must be held accountable, and victims deserve justice and reparation. High Commissioner, we are particularly concerned about the forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. How can we support your work in this context? In closing, we also reiterate our strong support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, High Commissioner. Last week, the Commission of Inquiry confirmed to this Council that Russia is committing numerous violations of international humanitarian law, many of which amount to war crimes. Your very thoughtful update this morning only reinforces the devastating impact of Russia's war. Impacts tragically denied by Russia in this hall this morning. In territory under Russian control, including illegally annexed Crimea, innocent civilians bear the brunt of Russia's aggression, subjected to unimaginable abuses and denied even the most basic rights and freedoms. Yet denied again in this hall. Russia's disinformation campaign is in full swing, including here. And their statement that Ukraine is committing violations against children is both farcical and insulting. Let me remind this room that the Commission of Inquiry has found that war crimes are being committed by Russian forces on a large scale. Russia is attempting and failing to break the spirit of the brave people of Ukraine through terror and maximising hardship. Their failure doesn't make Putin's disregard for human rights or dignity any less horrifying. It's time to end the ceaseless attacks, to withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine's sovereign territory, end the lies. What more can we do, High Commissioner, to support those living under Russian oppression, particularly those most vulnerable, such as children and the disabled?
Thank you. And the next speaker is Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España se une a la declaración de la Unión Europea y agradecemos al Alto Comisionado su actualización. Su informe nos hace recordar que la reacción firme y contundente de la comunidad internacional durante este año ante la agresión rusa contra Ucrania responde a la violación del derecho internacional y de los derechos humanos. Durante esta sesión se han evocado hechos constitutivos de crímenes de guerra y posiblemente de lesa humanidad, con la población civil ucraniana como macabra diaria. Diana, se siguen produciendo desapariciones arbitrarias, ejecuciones sumarias, torturas, actos de violencia sexual, traslados forzosos de niños y trato cruel a prisioneros de guerra sabiendas de su ilegalidad y brutalidad. España hace nuevamente un llamamiento al fin de la agresión de Rusia y a la rendición de cuentas de los responsables de estas atrocidades. Las consecuencias de esta invasión de la agresión de Rusia y a la rendición de cuentas de los responsables de estas atrocidades. Las consecuencias de esta invasión injustificada afectan a todos los países en materia de seguridad alimentaria, refugiados, incertidumbre y ataque a los principios más elementales que nos unen en esta sala. Defendemos la soberanía, la integridad territorial, los valores democráticos, un orden internacional basado en reglas y por ende una paz dentro de los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. España renueva su solidaridad y apoyo al pueblo de Ucrania. Señor Alto Comisionado, ¿cómo podemos fortalecer desde el multilateralismo los mecanismos de lucha contra la impunidad, incluyendo el trabajo de su oficina? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Albania, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Bucha is a name that evokes horror. The massacre of innocent civilians revealed in the wake of retreating Russian forces 1 year ago today was the beginning of a growing body of harrowing evidence of Russia's illegal and barbaric actions. The 400 days of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine have been a gruesome testimony of the horrendous human cost of this war. Children are among the most vulnerable. Some 4.6 million children have been internally or externally displaced since Russia's full-scale invasion. More than 500 children have been killed in Ukraine, and more than 1,000 have been wounded. More than 650 schools and more than 600 medical facilities have been attacked. And more than 16,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped and taken to Russia. Children should not be the spoils of war, but forced transfers and deportations of Ukrainian children are part of Russia's policy, illegal and unconscionable as every other aspect of its aggression against Ukraine. Albania thanks the OHCHR and all other mechanisms for the meticulous effort to uncover the truth of Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, and acknowledging the deep scars of trauma the Ukrainian people endure. The victims of Russia's aggression deserve justice, and those responsible for human rights violations and international crimes will be held accountable. I thank you.
Thank you. Turkey, you have the floor.
The war in Ukraine has caused extreme human suffering. It has profound and long-lasting consequences for human rights of Ukrainians. Thousands of civilians, including children, have lost their lives. Millions had to leave their homes. Many are stranded in areas affected by the conflict. The material damage has reached billions of dollars. Reports on particularly heavy toll of the war on women and children are very concerning. To alleviate the sufferings of civilians and to provide humanitarian relief, safety and freedom of the movement of the UN and other international organizations must be guaranteed and unhindered. Treating prisoners of war humanely at all times is the fundamental obligation of states. The prohibition of torture and ill treatment is absolute. Its prevention starts with ensuring the access of independent observers to detainees. Accountability is vital to deter and prevent violations of international humanitarian law as well as international human rights law. We reiterate our call to conduct fair, prompt and impartial investigations on all allegations of violations and to hold perpetrators accountable. Mr. President, we reaffirm our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Crimea. The situation of the Crimean Tatar Turks, the indigenous people of Crimea, is always a priority for our country. Turkey will continue to support Crimean Tatars with a view to preserving their identity and ensuring that they live in their historical homeland in peace and safety. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm inviting Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Georgia thanks the High Commissioner for the important update. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to cause immense suffering for Ukrainian people. Georgia strongly condemns this unprovoked aggression, which is a clear violation of the international law and UN Charter. The report documents the attacks against civilians, including children, indiscriminate use of explosives, killings, torture, ill treatment and sexual violence, summary executions committed by the Russian armed forces. As per report, the circumstances of the summary executions provide strong indications that they may amount to the war crimes of willful killing. Justice must be served through international legal mechanisms, including ICC, and perpetrators must be held accountable. Georgia, as a member of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, will continue to contribute its effort to this end. We call on the High Commissioner and his team on the ground to continue to document all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Let me also underline the importance of the work by the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and extension of its mandate. We reiterate our call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ of 16 March, which binds Russia to immediately suspend the military operations and withdraw all its forces and armaments from the whole territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Montenegro.
Mr. President, Montenegro thanks the High Commissioner and Office for the important updates. We remain appalled by the shocking magnitude of Russia's atrocities and hostilities against Ukraine and its population. As documented, the patterns, frequency, severity, and the scale of indiscriminate civilian casualties and the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure strongly indicate that violations of international law and international humanitarian law have been recurred, and as found, many of which may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. The growing body of evidence of forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation and their illegal adoption is particularly shocking, as is their placement in centers for so-called military and patriotic education and the like. These crimes is the most pronounced reflection of the brutal face of Russia's fully flagged war of aggression against Ukraine must be stopped in their words, and those responsible must be held to account. The report's findings also reveal strong patterns of inhumane treatment of prisoners of war that included the regular practice of torture and ill treatment and poor internment conditions as a part of a wider Russian war tactics. We reiterate our strong advocacy for ensuring full accountability for all violations of international law and grave crimes committed in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There must be no impunity. Victims' right to truth, justice and reparation must be also ensured, as well as guarantees of non-recurrence. Montenegro remains firmly committed to Ukraine's sovereignty.
Australia, you are the next.
Australia thanks the High Commissioner for his rigorous oral update. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. Australia recognises the critical role of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine in documenting serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Australia expresses its deepest sympathy to the over 20,000 civilian casualties, their families and the communities of Ukraine. Electricity and water shortages are placing an unbearable toll on Ukrainian citizens, with nearly 18 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The multilateral system is a crucial means for the international community to hold perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses to account. It is also critical to supporting Ukraine to uphold the human rights of its people. Russia's war is also propelling the food and energy crisis. What can the international community do to help Ukraine to protect the rights of its people and prevent this conflict from exacerbating food security and other global challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns with the EU statement and thank the High Commissioner for his update. For 13 months, Ukraine has been withstanding Russia's invasion that brought massive devastation. Aggression on Ukraine is an attack on democracy and on the rules-based international order. The international community condemned the unprovoked and unjustified war by Russia and called for the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The aggression against Ukraine is pushing the world towards more chaos, causing food and energy crises. Croatia stands behind Ukraine's leadership and its people, who are defending the values of freedom, democracy and peace, not only in their country, but also in the whole democratic world. Croatia is particularly concerned about the documented violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by Russian forces. Many of them may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. We strongly condemn forcible transfer and deportation of civilians, in particular children, with Ukraine or to the Russian Federation. This abhorrent policy exposes children to further violations, trafficking, exploitation and abuse, as well as sexual and gender-based violence. We urge Russia to ensure swift and safe return of civilians, especially children, and to discontinue any measures in breach of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and to stop its aggression against Ukraine.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Belarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель. ОВКПЧ и правозащитные механизмы ООН должны строго придерживаться нейтральности и объективности в своих оценках. Правозащитная система ООН не должна служить инструментом, который используется противоборствующими сторонами друг против друга. Соблюдение беспристрастности позволит ОВКПЧ внести более весомый вклад в регулирование кризиса. К сожалению, в Украине продолжается раскручиваться спираль насилия, продолжаются жертвы и разрушения. Дальнейшая эскалация чревата непредсказуемыми катастрофическими последствиями. Трагический кровавый сценарий, который мы наблюдаем, является следствием игнорирования западными странами многочисленных предупреждений и инициатив, которые могли бы способствовать сохранению системы региональной и глобальной безопасности. Сегодня президент Александр Лукашенко призвал объявить перемирие в Украине, прекратить боевые действия и начать переговоры. Мы надеемся, что мир наконец услышит предложение Беларуси по регулированию конфликта. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Romania fully aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his oral update on the situations of the human rights in Ukraine. Independent investigations, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, 2 missions of experts under the OSCE Moscow mechanism, all have documented the large-scale violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law against the people of Ukraine caused by the Russians' military aggression. These range from indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure to willful killings, torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Romania condemns in the strongest terms Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and deplores the human suffering it caused. We are gravely concerned about reports on reported forced deportations and forcible transfers of Ukrainians to the Russian Federation, including children, a grave violation of international law. Human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law must continue to be documented and investigated
Our condemnation for the unacceptable atrocities, human rights and international humanitarian law violations committed in Ukraine should not cease. Perpetrators of the ongoing grave and massive violations of human rights and international humanitarian law must be held accountable. Romania is contributing to the efforts and will continue to offer its support to Ukraine for as long as it is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting Bulgaria.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria aligns with the statement by the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner for the oral update on Ukraine, presenting a continuously grim picture of the human rights and humanitarian situation in the country. We are steadfast in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and we stand firmly behind the people of Ukraine. More than a year after the start of Russia's unprovoked, unjustified and unlawful aggression against Ukraine, which Bulgaria condemns in the strongest possible terms, the hostilities continue to exert a severe toll on people across the country. Russia's war has resulted in gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law, including significant loss of civilian lives, widespread destruction and damage across Ukraine, in particular of medical and educational facilities as well as of critical energy infrastructure. Bulgaria reiterates its concern about the reported systematic deportation to Russia of civilians, children in particular, from temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. In this respect, we call for all those responsible for these gross human rights violations to be held to account. Mr. High Commissioner, how can states and the international community better support your office in monitoring the situation of human rights in Ukraine, including the fact-finding and evidence collection with regard to the unlawful forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian citizens to Russia? I thank you.
Thank you. Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The root cause of the current situation in Ukraine stems from the hegemonic policies of the US and the West. The US and the West have been clinging to the military threat through eastward expansion of NATO and the sanction coalition, while ignoring reasonable and just demand of Russian Federation to offer legitimate security guarantee. This compelled Russia to the special military operation in Ukraine as a legitimate response. It is the right of Russia to put an end in violation of the human rights of Russians and the slaughter targeting them committed by Ukraine under the instigation of the US and West, and to protect their legitimate right and interest. The anti-Russia human rights racket pursued by the US and West to demonize and isolate this country in international arena has nothing to do with the genuine protection and promotion of human rights, and constitute height of politicization, selectivity and double standards of human rights. We oppose any attempts of the US and West to use the UN human rights mechanism as a propaganda campaign forum against Russia. The international community should distinct essential of anti-Russia human rights racket unveiled by situation in Ukraine, and should not tolerate the politicization of human rights for despicable purpose of certain countries. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Belgium.
Président, ma délégation remercie le haut-commissaire pour son exposé oral et le remercie ainsi que la mission de surveillance des droits humains en Ukraine d'avoir préparé 2 rapports. La Russie a utilisé des armes explosives à large spectre contre des infrastructures énergétiques critiques, des installations médicales et des bâtiments résidentiels ne constituant aucune cible militaire légitime apparente. Ces attaques présentent toutes les caractéristiques d'attaques indiscriminées et disproportionnées. 3000 établissements scolaires ont été endommagés ou détruits, ce qui a eu un impact sur l'éducation des enfants. Les transferts forcés, les déportations d'enfants sont particulièrement préoccupants. Les 2 rapports reflètent et documentent cette pratique qui constitue un crime de guerre. La Fédération de Russie devrait fournir des informations fiables, faciliter une communication efficace entre les enfants et leurs familles et entreprendre rapidement leur retour en Ukraine, comme l'exige le droit international. Pour ce mépris à l'égard de la protection des civils et pour l'instrumentalisation des enfants dans cette guerre, les auteurs et les commanditaires de ces crimes devront répondre de leurs actes. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, que peut-on faire de plus pour que la 3e Convention de Genève sur la protection des prisonniers de guerre soit respectée par toutes les parties? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Syrian Arab Republic, you have the floor.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. تعيد سوريا رفضها لتسييس مسائل حقوق الإنسان واستخدامها كوسيلة لتحقيق غايات جيوسياسية لدول أصبحت معروفة داخل المجلس، كما تكرر رفضها للقرارات التي تعلي من روح التصادمية والتجاذب داخل المجلس بدلا من استخدام الحوار البناء والشفاف البعيد عن التسييس مع كافة الأطراف المعنية. ويعبر وفد بلادي عن قلقه من الدفع إلى تحويل غالبية بنود مجلس حقوق الإنسان إلى بند رابع آخر واستهداف دول بعينها بذرائع أصبحت واهية. إن التوسع في القرارات والآليات التي تستهدف دول بعينها وزجها في جميع البنود تهدد من مصداقية عمل المجلس وتعرضه للانقسام المتزايد والاستقطاب التي أصبحت سمته. إن معالجة الأزمات في العالم بما في ذلك أزمات حقوق الإنسان تبدأ في دراسة الأسباب الجذرية لها وعدم تجاهلها كالفرض المتزايد للإجراءات القسرية الأحادية الجانب على الشعب الروسي ما يعرضه لمعاناة متزايدة بذريعة إعلاء حقوق الإنسان، بالإضافة إلى التوسع المستمر لحلف الناتو والسعي إلى تطويق روسيا عبر وسائل عسكرية كنشر القواعد والأحزمة الصاروخية، فضلا عن دعم الكتائب المتطرفة والعناصر التخريبية بحجة إعلاء الديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
And the last country on my list is Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement, and we thank the High Commissioner for his update. My delegation is appalled by the dire human rights situation across Ukraine amid the ongoing armed attack by the Russian Federation. High Commissioner's reports on the arbitrary deprivation of life, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, torture and ill treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence are a cause of grave concern. We note with concern the findings of the High Commissioner's report on the treatment of prisoners of war. Throughout the past year, Slovenia has time and again expressed our condemnation of Russian unprovoked military aggression which resulted in undescribable suffering of civilian population. This Council has an undeniable role to play in order to ensure that the victims and survivors of the atrocities can fulfill their right to remedy, truth and reparations. Mr. High Commissioner, what more can be done to support the work of your office in relation to the forcible transfers and deportations of Ukrainian children to Russia? I thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with the National Human Rights Institution, Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights by video.
Distinguished colleagues, I express my gratitude for the work of Office of the High Commissioner and Monitoring Mission and for their conclusions and recommendations in their latest report. Some of the violations of human rights in Ukraine require more attention. It is also worth noting that Ukraine continues to fulfill its international legal obligations and bears responsibility for its territory and population being the defending state. The aggressor state is guided by the right of force and motives opposite to the notion of justice and peace. So when presenting problematics of compliance with international humanitarian law in Ukraine suffering unprovoked military aggressions, the proportionality as to the victim and the aggressor might lead to deserters, especially when the aggressor refuses to cooperate with humanitarian organizations and the defender cooperates in full. I call on the Office of the High Commissioner and Monitoring Mission continue their work towards strengthening human rights protection in Ukraine and ensuring accountability.
Thank you. And the first NGO on my list is International Fellowship of Reconciliation. You have the floor.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, we thank you for the update. IFOR stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are suffering for the ongoing war of aggression by the Russian Federation, which is causing tragedies and violation and inhumane nuclear threat. War should be abolished. We stand in solidarity with those who courageously refuse to kill and call on the international community to ensure full legal guarantees of their human right to conscientious objection and to provide them protection and asylum. The right to conscientious objection to military service should be protected and cannot be restricted, as highlighted in the last OHCHR thematic report. The right to conscientious objection in Ukraine is currently suspended. We call on Ukraine to release the prisoner of conscience Vitaly Alexenko, jailed on February 23. We appeal for the acquittal of conscientious objector Hennady Tomyuk. We are concerned for the case of Andriy Vishnevsky, a conscientious objector held in the army at frontline, who should be discharged on the grounds of conscience. It has been also reported that the Kiev Regional Military Administration decided to terminate alternative service of tens of conscientious objectors in order to appear in military recruitment center. We are also concerned about the forced detention of Russian refusers to war in the occupied territories, as highlighted in our joint press release. We call on this Council to guarantee the protection of all human rights, including the right to conscientious objection, which is inherent in the right to freedom of conscience, thought and religion. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will continue with Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety.
Thank you. War in Ukraine has led to death and detention of many journalists. Only yesterday, a Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Gershkovich was arrested in Russia on spying charge. The IRFS called for his immediate release. Situation with freedom of speech in the region is deteriorating due to Russian aggression against Ukraine. There is an unseen level of propaganda being used by Russian authorities in Russia itself, in the occupied parts of Ukraine and our region countries. In Ukraine territories occupied by Russia, the occupation authorities use the censors to suppress local media. No true information can reach the local population. The most vulnerable people are Crimean Tatars, who have been living under Russian occupation since 2014. Many countries in the region, such as Belarus, Georgia, Azerbaijan and others, emulate Russian practice of suspension against critics. As a result, the general situation with the freedom of speech in the regions is worsening. War in Ukraine also put into the difficult position many NGOs in neighboring countries. There is a clear decrease of democratization program in the post-Soviet space. Ukrainian today is clear priority for all of us, but other countries, neighbors of Russia, should also receive support from international donor community to strengthen civil society. We shouldn't also forget civil society in Russia. Pressure should be brought on regime to free critics such as Alexei Navalny, Kara Murza, Ilya Yashin, Maria Ponomarenko and others. A mechanism for including journalists and bloggers in prison exchanges should be also become a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Conscience and Peace Tax International.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let there be no mistake. Ukraine is fighting for survival against an invader which has committed massive human rights violations, war crimes, and probably crimes against humanity. But it is essential that it does not itself undermine the very values which it is defending. That is why we welcomed the assurance by the ambassador that accusations of war crimes committed by Ukrainian forces are currently being investigated. That is also why we must express our dismay at the suspension, shortly after the Russian invasion, of Ukraine's provisions for conscientious objection to military service, of which move Vitaly Alexenko is the first imprisoned victim. What does recognition of conscientious objection mean if it cannot be invoked in time of war? And what practical benefit arises from condemning to prison persons who would willingly help their country's struggle by performing a civilian service of public utility? CPTI calls on Ukraine to redeem itself without delay by not only reinstating alternative service, extending the duration as necessary to reflect the state of emergency, but also by making it available to all conscientious objectors, as the Human Rights Committee has repeatedly recommended. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Institute for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. President. Institute for Human Rights highly commends the immense work of the OHCHR carried out in the field of documenting and revealing the endless list of Russian war crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine. We are deeply concerned over the growing body of evidence of hostilities used by Russian armed forces to cause enormous suffering to the people of Ukraine. A completely disgraceful violation of Geneva Convention, as well as treaty and customary international humanitarian law in regard to the treatment of Ukraine Ukrainian prisoners of war is of particular concern. The presented report of the UNHRC extensively exposes serious human rights violations that may constitute war crimes, as those POWs in the power of the Russian Federation were subjected to beatings, electrocution, sexual violence, lack of medical care, water, food, hygiene and sanitation, as well as other forms of torture and ill treatment to extract confessions and testimonies. We also would like to bring to the attention of the Council a completely falsified trial of Russian occupation authorities upon Ukrainian POWs Maxim Butkevich, Viktor Pohozy and Vladislav Shel, conducted to legalize political repressions against Ukrainians. Institute for Human Rights stresses the importance to ensure full accountability of perpetrators, as there can be no impunity for those who violated international law. Mr. High Commissioner, what steps can be taken by the Member States and major stakeholders to facilitate the safe repatriation of affected POWs? Thank you.
Thank you. World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations, intervention through video.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for the regular report. We draw attention to increasing cases of unjustified detention, forcible transfer and imprisonment of Ukrainian civilians as hostages by the Russian Federation, which is prohibited by international humanitarian law. We are concerned about the improper detention conditions, imprisonment and ill treatment of the Ukrainian female prisoners by the Russian Federation. While being held hostage, the women were either threatened with physical abuse or subjected to physical abuse and torture. The Russian military does not keep records of arrested persons. Victims are often not informed of the reasons for their detention. These acts are not reviewed by legal authority, and families are not informed of their whereabouts. Some are still missing. In most cases, the detention took place under inhumane conditions. We are highly concerned that representatives of international humanitarian organizations do not have access to most places of detention to ensure proper treatment of prisoners in compliance with the Geneva Conventions. The international protection for female prisoners is critical for Ukraine. We call on the international community to increase the pressure of sanctions on the Russian Federation for the improper treatment of prisoners, to demand that Russia provide regular lists of prisoners with clarifications regarding civilian and military women, to ensure as much as possible the proper humane and gender-sensitive conditions of detention for these prisoners, to take an active part in setting up special psychological counseling centers for female prisoners of war and civilian hostages released from detention. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the UN Watch from the floor.
Mr. President, 1 year ago, citing gross violations by Russia in its aggression against Ukraine, the General Assembly voted to remove that country from this council. Sadly, the abuses are ongoing. Russian attacks against civilians in Ukraine, including systematic torture and killings, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Repeated attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure have left hundreds of thousands without heat and electricity during the coldest months. And yet, brave Ukrainians, led by President Zelensky, are resisting the invasion. Volunteer civilians and veterans are fighting back, tracking the movements of Russian troops, sharing information, and blowing up supply bridges. They risk arrest, torture, and even death. Courageous Russians are also resisting, such as dissident Vladimir Karamurza. On April 11, 2022, in Moscow, he went on CNN and dared to criticize the war in Ukraine. He called the Kremlin, quote, a regime of murderers. Hours later, he was taken away, arrested, and now faces false charges and a lifetime in prison. Now almost 1 year behind bars, Vladimir Karamurza's health has deteriorated so much that he was unable to attend court for his recent trial. Earlier in this session, Russia announced that they will run for a seat to try to return to this Human Rights Council. If member states consider the suffering of millions in Ukraine and of the Kremlin's political prisoners, they will know how to vote. I thank you.
Thank you. And I'm inviting Amnesty International.
Mr. President, the reports presented by the High Commissioner show starkly how Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has had a horrifying impact on the human rights of civilians and soldiers alike. We are seriously alarmed by the patterns of treatment of prisoners of war identified by the High Commissioner. Earlier this month, 3 Ukrainian prisoners of war, including Maxim Butkevich, a journalist and human rights defender, were subject to sham trials in Russia-occupied Luhansk and Donetsk, which led to lengthy prison sentences. By handing justice over alleged war crimes to an unrecognized judiciary in Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine, Russia is violating international humanitarian law. It is abundantly clear that these show trials are nothing but an act of ruthless retribution against Ukrainian prisoners of war. We thank the High Commissioner for his focus on the impact of the invasion on older people and others in vulnerable situations. Ukraine's government has taken important steps towards protecting human rights, but at-risk groups are often left behind. We ask how the international community can support Ukraine's efforts to protect people in vulnerable situations in this context. There can be no just, sustainable peace without accountability. The ICC arrest warrants issued against Vladimir Putin and Russia's Children's Rights Commissioner are an important step towards showing that those suspected of crimes under international law in Ukraine will face arrest and trial, no matter how powerful they are. There are many more war crimes and crimes against humanity for which the Russian leadership is potentially responsible. Given the need for a victim-centred approach to accountability and the scale of the crimes committed, could the High Commissioner expand on possibilities for supplementary forms of accountability to ensure truth, justice and reparation? We thank you.
Thank you. And now 3 video interventions, first by Partners for Transparency.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, we would like to thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. Over 400 days have passed since the Russian-Ukrainian war has begun, and a ceasefire is still not in sight. Amidst unwillingness of both parties to conclude peace agreements, despite the many initiatives made in this regard, the latest of which is the Chinese initiative. The EU and America have spent about $106 billion in the previous year to arm Ukraine, and they plan to pay more, which warns of the continuation of the war that may threaten any efforts of reaching an agreement, causing more civilian casualties. According to the estimates, this war claimed the lives of 30,000 civilians, most of them women and children. This war cost the global economy $1.6 trillion and is likely to cost an additional $1 trillion if the war continues for another year. These are the consequences that disproportionately affect poor and developing countries. Mr. President, Partners therefore calls on the Council to express condemnation of the exaggerated spending of the European countries and the US on the war and the arming of Ukrainian forces, and we also recommend the parties to the conflict to enter into unconditional negotiations to reach a peaceful settlement to this conflict and to consider the initiatives made by member states to end the war, which may avoid more bloodshedding. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next is Juventum.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Juventum is honored to participate. We would like to complement the numerous reports by raising concerns about the long-term negative impacts on health and the environment. We may have to witness a war between tactical nuclear weapons and the depleted uranium weapons. The previous radioactive war zones raised serious concerns among the medical community. The human rights-based approach has to be precautionary. Chernobyl's nuclear fallout was 2,000 times that of Hiroshima. Europe's largest capacity, Zaporizhzhia, is walking on a tightrope. IAEA officers stationed there keep reporting precarious conditions. Massively expensive nuclear plants are corruption machines and take a decade to operate. The energy situation will be very different in 10 years. The most talented in science and engineering are rapidly improving the new clean energy technologies every day. All they need is more investment. We hope the war will not last forever. Considering the irreversible negative impact on health and the environment, we must remove dirty nuclear from the energy options and focus on honest, clean energy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And the last video intervention is done by Mezan Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, President. And we would like to thank the High Commissioner for his report. The Commission of Inquiry found that acts in Ukraine may amount to crimes against humanity. The scale and severity of the war between the two countries has made this extremely apparent. It has been over a year since the invasion, yet the aggression of the war is continuing to increase. Arbitrary executions, thousands more subject to forced deportation, sexual violence and torture, and ill treatment of children, to name a few. Time and time again, states, the international community and UN mechanisms watch the most vulnerable suffer at the hands of aggression. As we have learned from past invasions, being silent is being complicit. Those in this room cannot continue to be silent in the continuing of this destructive war. We need immediate collective efforts to stop the war. Every day, millions of people are suffering from the continuation of conflicts. How many times are we going to watch people suffer before we achieve peace? Mizan Centre for Human Rights and Geneva International Centre for Justice give our fullest support to the victims of the continuing war. The Russian Federation and Ukraine must sit together and negotiate a peace plan. I thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, since we've exhausted both list of speakers, let me now give the floor to the High Commissioner for his concluding remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and also thank all the delegations for their observations, but also for their questions and comments. Perhaps just at the outset, let's bear in mind that we are discussing here a situation where we have seen a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and international law. And I think it is against this backdrop that we are considering the human rights situation in Ukraine. A number of questions were asked in relation to our access, my office's access to the occupied territory of Ukraine. And as I think we have reported to you, since last summer, my office has not had access to the occupied territory of Ukraine, and unfortunately the Russian Federation does not allow my office to conduct its monitoring in the territory it occupies. As a result, and that's what happens in such circumstances, we have been monitoring the human rights situation remotely from offices in government-controlled areas, and of course through our regular fact-finding missions in areas under government control. We have done this in the past. As you know, the fact-finding, my office has been there since 2014, in particular, for example, also in relation to Crimea, since 2014. And the findings that we had then were always based on direct interviews with victims and witnesses of human rights violations, including detainees and prisoners of war who were released from facilities in occupied territory of the Russian Federation. Of course, the same strict, rigorous methodology and standards of proof apply, including when we do remote monitoring work. It is clear what needs to happen is access to the occupied territory of Ukraine, and so that we can fulfill our monitoring obligations according to international law. There are a number of questions asked around the forced transfers and the deportations of children, which is indeed very troubling. My mission on the ground is still documenting these allegations of forced transfers and deportations of children, and the current findings that we have, they are set out in the report that you have in front of you. Again, I note the lack of access to Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory and to the Russian Federation itself, which make it more difficult to assess the full extent of forced transfers and deportations. Again, we will use the methodology of remote monitoring techniques, as we have done elsewhere in this type of situations, and we have also been in touch with various partners, both within the UN family but also outside the UN family, to see what can be done jointly. And it is important, especially for the Council, to make sure that the Russian Federation shares information about children that were displaced from Ukraine, that family reunification is facilitated by establishing a functioning mechanism to identify these children and trace their family links. It's important to consistently and coherently and robustly remind the obligations to respect international humanitarian law, international human rights law when evacuating any person, but in particular children, and to fully adhere to the prohibition on changing the personal status of children displaced from Ukraine, including their nationality, and to ensure that no adoptions of children separated from their parents take place during and immediately after after the international armed conflict. Finally, the Council should make sure that we support all efforts that bring those who are responsible for it to justice. We will, of course, my office will continue to monitor and document and report on our findings as we go through them. On accountability, because a lot of you asked about what more can be done about accountability, and it is actually one of those aspects when I was in Ukraine in December last year that I discussed both with the different counterparts, the ombudsperson that we just saw, but also the Prosecutor General. I think it's clear that accountability needs to be pursued at different levels, obviously at the national level itself. I mean, I understand that there are to date 72,000 criminal proceedings have been opened by the Ukrainian authorities, and we have about 25 persons who have been convicted of war crimes. I mean, obviously there is a lot of support that the Ukrainian authorities need in that regard, especially on forensics. But there are also regional and international mechanisms, and they obviously require our support, including the type of work that needs to be done between the different reporting, documenting mechanisms, including through this council, and other areas of accountability mechanisms, and that's absolutely critical for us. There was one question about allegations of genocide. As you know, my office examines facts on the ground on the basis of information that is available to it, and we draw legal conclusions from the information that we are able to gather. As you know, we have repeatedly expressed serious concern as to the international crimes that were committed in form of war crimes, for example, and we have just seen the report, the most recent report of the International Commission of Inquiry that also stated the very concerning possibility of crimes against humanity. So our own analysis at this stage doesn't go to further crimes, but we will obviously continue to very carefully monitor, assess, and report consistent with our standard methodology. I think then there were a couple of questions around prisoners of war. I mean, it's obvious when it comes to the treatment of prisoners of war that we have very clear norms contained both in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and for us it's clear that they need to be respected. It's also important to ensure, and I think this is for all member states who have any influence, to ensure that return and repatriation of all those who are seriously wounded, sick prisoners of war, that they are actually repatriated. I had a chance when I was in Ukraine to actually talk to families of prisoners of war, and I could hear their plight, and it was very distressing. So whatever can be done to ensure that, you know, prisoners of war can actually go back to their families, are released, that's incredibly important. And let's also, if one looks what can be done beyond the parties, I think let's also look at Part 4 of the 3rd Geneva Convention, where member states may offer to make arrangements for the accommodation of the sick and wounded prisoners of war in the territory, because especially if they have undergone long periods of captivity. And again, I hope that independent monitors can have access, unfettered access, to places of internment in the Russian Federation and in the occupied territory in Ukraine. A number of you asked, or I think it was one of you asked about conflict-related sexual violence. As we have stated in the report, my office has documented over 140 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, most of them imputable to Russian armed forces and law enforcement officials, and the cases fall essentially into two categories: those where sexual violence was used as a method of torture and in treatment against men, especially prisoners of war in detention settings, and those involving, that's the second category, those involving rape, including gang rape of women and girls in areas controlled by Russian armed forces. And most cases that we documented fall into the first category. It's difficult, we discussed it many times with the office, difficult for us still to assess the prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence outside the context of detention. Then there were questions in relation, I have two more sets, questions related to assistance and reparations for victims and survivors. And again, I think it's part also of the humanitarian response in support of what Ukraine is doing itself to make sure that the victims of the war are properly taken care of, especially. And I think we all know about the need for more support for adequate housing for displaced people, in particular for older people, those with disabilities. And I can only encourage and appeal to the international community to help Ukraine expand the social housing options for displaced people so they are also adapted to the needs of older people and persons with disabilities. This requires obviously a lot more support from the donor community to make sure that the existing national structures are supported in an adequate manner to be able to cater for people who are falling into this very vulnerable category. And then there was the question on the impact. I think one delegation asked the impact on food security. I mentioned it in my statement earlier. I mean, the war in Ukraine has precipitated the most severe global cost of living crisis in a generation. I mean, we know and we can see it even, well, we also had, let's not forget the COVID pandemic, but we have seen decades-long efforts in human development, in the reduction of hunger and malnutrition, in the improvements in health and living standards at risk, at severe risk. And as I mentioned in my statement, it is absolutely critical for the Black Sea Grain Initiative that this just continues and these efforts are supported so that the world can benefit from at least this very important initiative and that the parties to it are encouraged to make sure that it goes beyond the current cutoff date in May 2023 and also to de-link issues of global food security from political considerations. I think that's very important for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner, for being with us, for your insights and comments. Thank you, colleagues, for engaging throughout this interactive dialogue. This is the end of the dialogue and this is the end of the meeting. We will reconvene this afternoon at 3 p.m. to have the high-level interactive dialogue to assess developments in the situation of human rights on the ground in the Central African Republic, which will be followed by the interactive dialogue on High Commissioner's report on South Sudan. So let me close the 51st meeting of the 52nd session of the Human Rights Council and let me wish you good afternoon, bon appétit and have a good weekend.
For those who don't come.